The sound of oars cutting through the water echoed across the fog-laden fjords as the longship sailed into the mist, its sleek wooden hull reflecting the pale light of dawn. The crew, silent but tense, strained their eyes as they neared their destination. They had heard the legends, whispered around firelit halls and in the depths of drunken taverns. Stories of treasures lost to time, buried deep within the northern reaches of the world, beyond the eyes of the great kingdoms. These weren't just stories of gold or jewels but of secrets, the kind of secrets that could change the course of history itself. This was the call of the North, a call that beckoned men and women, not just to seek wealth, but to embrace the mystery that lived in the cold, biting winds and shadowed forests of the Viking world. It was a land carved by ice and fire, where heroes and gods walked the same soil, and where treasures of unimaginable power were hidden, waiting to be uncovered by those brave enough to face the unknown. The Vikings, known across the known world as ruthless warriors, were also master traders and explorers. They roamed the seas, their longships carrying them across continents, from the icy shores of Scandinavia to the golden streets of Byzantium. But what drove them? What was it that pushed them to venture so far beyond the horizon, leaving behind their families and villages in search of riches, not just in the form of plunder, but in something deeper? As the longship cut through the fog, it wasn't just a journey for treasure. It was a journey for something far more valuable: knowledge, power, and the secrets of the world. These Vikings weren't seeking to pillage villages for mere coin. They were seeking the ancient artifacts and forgotten relics that could offer them dominion over life and death, power over their enemies, and perhaps even the gods themselves. The treasures they sought were not just material. They were imbued with myths, bound by magic, and steeped in ancient lore that had been passed down through generations of Viking kings and chieftains. The stories of their journeys were vast and varied, filled with legends of enchanted swords, cursed rings, and treasures that had the power to shape the world. Some believed these treasures were hidden away in secret burial sites, beneath the soil of ancient kingdoms, or in the deep, forgotten caves scattered across the northern wilderness. Others spoke of mystical items, Viking relics that could summon the gods themselves, or provide unimaginable strength in battle. The Vikings believed that the land itself held secrets, that beneath the earth, under the mountains, or in the very depths of the seas, there was treasure waiting to be claimed. These treasures weren't just meant for personal gain. No, they were sacred, part of a greater cosmic plan that tied the fate of the gods, the kings, and the warriors together. The truth about these treasures, however, remains lost to time. The sagas speak of them in hushed tones, and those who have ventured too far in search of them have either met untimely deaths or returned with only fragments of the great treasures they sought. The buried secrets of the Vikings remain elusive, hidden beneath layers of myth and mystery, waiting for someone to unlock their power. But what if these treasures weren't lost at all? What if they had been deliberately hidden? Hidden so deeply that only the bravest of hearts could uncover them. In a world where religion, power, and knowledge were in constant flux, the Vikings understood that the true value of their treasures lay not in the wealth they could generate, but in the power they could command. Could these treasures hold the key to a deeper understanding of Viking culture, their gods, and their place in the world? In this vast, sprawling landscape of ice and stone, where each mountain, each fjord, and each river held stories waiting to be discovered, there was something more. The treasures were not simply buried. They were waiting for the right moment, the right person to come along and discover them. These treasures could not be claimed by just anyone. They were protected by forces greater than any single Viking. The mysteries they contained could only be unlocked by those with the strength to face the darkness, the courage to push beyond the known, and the wisdom to understand what they truly represented. This was the allure of the Viking treasures. They weren't just objects of wealth or conquest. They were symbols of something far greater, of destiny, of power, of a connection to the divine. They were the key to understanding the Viking world in a way that few could ever truly grasp. What if these treasures had been lost not just to history, but to the very fabric of the universe? What if they were hidden because the world wasn't ready for them? What if the truth behind them could forever alter the course of history? As the longship drifted toward its destination, the fog parted, revealing an ancient shoreline, one that had not seen the footsteps of a man for centuries. This was the beginning of a journey that would uncover the secrets of the Viking world, the truth behind their greatest loot. And as the crew disembarked, stepping onto the shore of a forgotten land, one thing was certain. The mysteries they were about to uncover would challenge everything they knew about the Vikings, and perhaps even everything they knew about history itself. The treasure they sought wasn't just gold or silver. It was something much more elusive, more dangerous. It was the hidden past of a civilization that had left behind a legacy of mystery, a legacy that would reveal itself only to those who dared to seek it out. What lay ahead on that forgotten shore was far more than a simple fortune. It was a revelation that would change everything. And the journey was just beginning. The Vikings are often remembered as brutal raiders who descended upon villages with fire and steel, leaving only devastation in their wake. But this perception barely scratches the surface of their true legacy. Beyond the plunder and destruction, the Viking world was a complex and thriving society, where the pursuit of wealth was only one piece of a much larger puzzle. The truth is, the Vikings were not just warriors, they were navigators, traders, and explorers. Their world was built upon a foundation of daring voyages, strategic alliances, and a fierce sense of adventure. At the heart of the Viking way of life was a relentless drive to explore the unknown. Their ships, known for their speed and agility, could traverse vast distances, cutting through stormy seas and navigating unfamiliar coasts. It was their ability to travel, to stretch their reach beyond the icy shores of Scandinavia, that allowed the Vikings to build such an expansive empire. They didn't just raid and conquer. They traded with distant lands, formed intricate alliances with powerful empires, and established far-reaching influence across Europe, Asia, and even North America. The Vikings were born from a world of harsh climates and even harsher battles. Their homeland, with its rugged fjords and dense forests, was a place where survival depended not only on strength but on resourcefulness and cunning. To thrive in this unforgiving environment, they had to be more than just fighters. They had to be clever, adapting quickly to the changing tides of war and peace, always searching for opportunities to expand their influence and gain wealth. This was a society that prized honor and reputation, but it also understood the value of power and control. Their pursuit of wealth was not driven solely by the need for material gain, but by the belief that treasure, whether gold, silver, or something more mystical, could elevate them, provide them with greater power, and perhaps even secure them favor with the gods. In their world, treasure was not just a symbol of prosperity. It was a means to an end. With wealth came status, and with status came the potential to shape the future of their clans and kingdoms. The more treasure they gathered, the more influence they could wield, both among their own people and in the larger world. Yet, for all their material desires, the Vikings were deeply connected to their gods and their mythology. For them, treasure was sacred. It was a link between the mortal realm and the divine. Weapons, shields, and amulets were imbued with magical significance, believed to protect the wearer or enhance their power. The pursuit of these treasures was often intertwined with their spiritual beliefs, as they sought artifacts that could grant them favor from the gods or protect them from the chaos of the world. In fact, much of Viking treasure was tied to their mythology. Items such as Thor's hammer or Odin's spear were not simply weapons. They were embodiments of divine power. These artifacts were seen as keys to the gods' favor, symbols of divine protection and strength. Many of the treasures the Vikings sought were believed to have the power to change the course of battles or ensure victory in war. The idea that treasure could hold spiritual significance, that it could somehow connect them with the divine, was central to their worldview. But it wasn't just material wealth that drove the Vikings. They sought knowledge as well, knowledge of the world, of the sea, of the stars, and of the unknown. The Vikings were some of the first Europeans to make contact with distant cultures, and they were keenly aware of the value of information. Their sagas speak of treasures not just in gold and silver, but in secrets and wisdom. It was this thirst for knowledge, this desire to understand the world around them, that drove them to explore lands far beyond their reach. They knew that in the distant lands of the East, in the Byzantine Empire, and in the heart of Asia, treasures existed that could grant them access to new technologies, new alliances, and new opportunities. In the east, the Vikings found themselves in the midst of a world vastly different from their own. Here, in the courts of the Byzantine Empire, they became the Varangians, elite mercenaries in service to the emperor. The wealth they encountered in these lands was beyond anything they had imagined. The Varangians were richly rewarded for their service, and many returned home with treasures that had been collected from across the known world. These treasures weren't just material goods. They were symbols of the Vikings' growing influence in global affairs. Through their connections with the Byzantine Empire, the Vikings gained access to a wealth of knowledge, weapons, and rare commodities that would forever change their world. But there was more to the Vikings' pursuit of treasure than mere conquest or expansion. They understood that power was fleeting, that the fortunes of kings and kingdoms could change with a single stroke of fate. For this reason, they were always looking ahead, always planning for the future. The greatest treasures were not just those found on the battlefield or in the vaults of distant kings. They were the ones that could secure their place in history. The artifacts they sought were not just the means to power. They were the means to immortality. The Vikings' understanding of treasure was also shaped by their belief in fate. In their mythology, treasure was often tied to the will of the gods. The greatest riches were those that were earned through bravery, skill, and honor, those that were bestowed upon the worthy. But not all treasure was to be had through noble deeds. Some were earned through cunning, deception, or outright violence. The Vikings, like the gods they worshipped, were not afraid to take what they believed was rightfully theirs. They understood that the world was not always fair, and that only the strongest, the boldest, and the most cunning could claim the greatest rewards. This philosophy of treasure-seeking, of conquering, claiming, and hoarding was essential to their way of life. It was the engine that drove their voyages, their battles, and their relentless pursuit of greatness. But what does it mean to pursue treasure with such intensity? What does it reveal about the Vikings' deepest desires and fears? The treasure they sought was not just a material possession. It was a manifestation of their deepest hopes and ambitions. For the Viking warrior, treasure represented the ultimate reward, a symbol of their place in the world and their connection to the divine. It was a reflection of their power, their courage, and their ability to shape their own fate. But it was also a reminder of the fragility of life, the fleeting nature of victory, and the inevitable approach of death. As the Vikings sailed toward new lands, seeking treasure and glory, they knew that their pursuit was more than just a quest for gold. It was a journey to secure their place in history, to become legends. The treasure they sought would not just be their own personal gain. It would be a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. And as they ventured further into the unknown, they could not help but wonder, what treasure would they find? And what price would they pay to claim it? In the end, the true treasure of the Viking world was not the wealth they amassed, but the legacy they left behind. A legacy of exploration, bravery, and the relentless pursuit of greatness. It was a treasure that could not be measured in gold, but in the stories that were passed down through generations. Stories of warriors who sailed across the seas in search of something greater, something beyond the reach of mere mortals. The Vikings sought treasures not just of this world, but of the next. And in doing so, they carved their names into the annals of history, forever remembered as the men and women who dared to seek the impossible. The wealth of the Viking world, like much of their legacy, is a subject shrouded in mystery. For centuries, historians and archaeologists have been captivated by the tales of riches amassed by these seafaring warriors, but the true extent of their wealth remains elusive. While the Vikings are often celebrated for their violent raids and territorial expansion, there is a much deeper and more complex story behind their riches. A story that intertwines exploration, trade, and the acquisition of rare and coveted items from across the known world. The first question that arises is, what did the Vikings consider wealth? For many, the answer seems obvious: gold and silver. But while material wealth was certainly a key part of their treasure trove, the Vikings also placed great value on items that had spiritual, cultural, or even mystical significance. Wealth was not simply measured in the number of coins or jewels a person could collect. It was also about power, status, and access to the sacred knowledge that treasures could bring. For a Viking warrior, treasure was a symbol of their standing in society and their connection to the divine, a reflection of their ability to shape the world around them. One of the most valuable sources of wealth for the Vikings came from the expansive trade networks they established. The Vikings were master traders who understood that wealth could be acquired through more than just raiding. Their longships, renowned for their speed and maneuverability, allowed them to sail up rivers and into the heart of foreign lands, bypassing the traditional barriers of trade that other cultures faced. The Viking trading network stretched from the British Isles to the Byzantine Empire, from the Mediterranean to the distant shores of the Volga River. Along the way, they forged connections with various cultures, exchanging goods, ideas, and treasures. Through their interactions with the Byzantine Empire, the Vikings gained access to some of the most coveted treasures of the ancient world. Gold, silver, and precious stones flowed into Viking hands, and in exchange, the Vikings offered their services as mercenaries and traders. The Varangians, as the Vikings came to be known in the Byzantine Empire, became an integral part of the emperor's personal guard, receiving lavish rewards for their loyalty. Many of these rewards took the form of treasures that were not just material, but symbolic of the Vikings' growing power and influence. It was in Byzantium that the Vikings encountered objects of immense value, both in terms of wealth and cultural significance. Fine silks, rare spices, intricate jewelry, and sacred relics became part of their collections. But these treasures were not merely items of luxury. For the Vikings, they represented something far more important: access to the gods and to divine power. The treasures they acquired from the East were believed to hold magical properties, capable of bestowing protection in battle, granting wisdom, or even influencing the fate of kings and warriors. The Vikings were not just raiders. They were collectors of the divine. At the same time, the Vikings were also masters of forging their own treasures. They were skilled craftsmen, renowned for their ability to create intricate weapons, shields, and jewelry that were as much works of art as they were tools of war. Viking swords, often passed down through generations, were considered sacred objects. They were believed to carry the spirits of the ancestors, and wielding one in battle was thought to be a direct connection to the gods. Viking jewelry, particularly brooches and arm rings, were also of great importance. These objects were worn not only as status symbols but as spiritual amulets, designed to protect the wearer and secure their place in the afterlife. In addition to their craft, the Vikings were also collectors of knowledge, an often overlooked but crucial aspect of their wealth. They were keenly aware that power and treasure could be obtained through the acquisition of secrets. This thirst for knowledge drove them to explore lands far beyond their homeland, bringing back treasures not just in the form of gold and silver, but in the form of ancient texts, maps, and stories. The Vikings encountered other cultures with rich intellectual traditions, and they learned from them. Some of these treasures, like the writings of the ancient Greeks and Romans, may have been lost to history had they not been passed down through the Viking world. The preservation of these intellectual treasures, along with the acquisition of rare artifacts and religious relics, helped cement the Vikings as a people deeply connected to both the material and spiritual realms. The Vikings' love of wealth was not limited to tangible objects. They also sought to control and accumulate power through political means. Raiding and trading were the primary avenues through which they expanded their influence, but it was through the acquisition of land and the establishment of settlements that they were able to secure long-term wealth. By the time the Viking Age came to an end, they had carved out vast territories, stretching from the British Isles to Russia, and from the Mediterranean to the North American continent. This territorial expansion allowed them to tap into new sources of wealth, including valuable agricultural land, mineral deposits, and trade routes. The Vikings' greatest treasure, however, was not something that could be measured in gold or silver. Their greatest treasure was the legacy they left behind, a legacy that included not just the material wealth they acquired but the cultural and intellectual riches that have shaped the modern world. Their exploration and trade opened up new pathways for commerce and communication, while their art, mythology, and literature continue to inspire generations. The Vikings were not just warriors. They were creators, builders, and thinkers, whose impact on history goes far beyond the wealth they accumulated. For centuries, the Vikings' treasure remained buried beneath the soil, lost in the mists of time. But modern archaeological discoveries have begun to uncover the secrets of their wealth, revealing glimpses of the vast riches they amassed. Viking hoards have been found in the most unexpected places, from the shores of the North Sea to the forests of Russia. These treasures offer valuable insights into the Viking world, shedding light on their trade routes, their connections with other cultures, and the power they wielded. Yet, even as more treasures are uncovered, there is still much we do not know. The full extent of the Vikings' wealth remains hidden, and perhaps it always will be. What is certain, however, is that the treasure the Vikings sought, both material and spiritual, was far more than mere riches. It was a reflection of their desire for power, immortality, and the favor of the gods. The treasures they acquired and the wealth they amassed were not just symbols of their status. They were the means by which they hoped to transcend their mortal existence, securing their place in both history and the afterlife. In the end, the greatest treasure of all was not the gold they plundered or the kingdoms they conquered. It was the legacy they left behind, a legacy of exploration, ambition, and the relentless pursuit of greatness. The myths surrounding Viking hoards are some of the most intriguing and enduring elements of their legacy. Tales of buried treasure, of riches hidden beneath ancient oak trees or deep in the earth, have captured the imaginations of people for centuries. These stories, passed down through generations, form a significant part of Viking lore, blending fact with fiction in ways that make it difficult to separate the two. But beneath the mythic veneer of these treasures lies a truth, a reality that is just as captivating, if not more so, than the legends themselves. The idea of hidden Viking treasure has been ingrained in popular culture for centuries, with countless tales of legendary hoards buried by warriors, kings, and chieftains who feared death and sought to ensure their wealth was not lost. One of the most enduring myths is that of the cursed treasure, a hoard hidden away by those who believed it would bring ruin to anyone who sought it. According to Viking belief, treasure was not just a material object. It was tied to the fate of the owner and could influence the lives of those who came into contact with it. Many Viking kings and warriors are said to have buried their wealth before they went into battle or as a safeguard against inevitable defeat. The treasure would either remain buried or, in some cases, be discovered by future generations, but only by those worthy of its power. One of the most famous examples of this mythic treasure is the story of the cursed gold of the north. According to the saga, a Viking king named Sigurd hoarded a vast fortune of gold and jewels, which he kept hidden in a secret cave. Before his death, he ordered that it be buried, as he believed that the treasure would only bring misfortune to those who sought it out. After his death, his treasure remained lost for centuries, with only whispers of its existence passing from one generation to the next. In the centuries that followed, many adventurers and treasure hunters set out to find it, but none returned. The belief in the curse of Sigurd's treasure only grew stronger with time, and the treasure became a symbol of the dangers that lay in seeking wealth beyond one's means. The Viking sagas are filled with similar tales of treasures buried by those who feared the repercussions of their wealth. In some cases, the treasure was buried to protect it from invaders or thieves. In others, it was hidden away as part of a burial ritual, meant to accompany the deceased into the afterlife. The Vikings believed that their treasures were not only material possessions, but also symbols of their power, strength, and legacy. Burying their wealth in the ground was a way to ensure that it would not fall into the wrong hands and would instead remain a part of their eternal legacy. But what if the treasures were not simply buried to be forgotten? What if they were hidden with a purpose, to protect them from the world, or perhaps to ensure that only those worthy of their power could access them? There is evidence to suggest that Viking treasure hoards were carefully hidden in locations that had special significance, such as sacred groves, ancient burial sites, or places tied to Viking mythology. These treasures were not simply placed in the earth at random. They were often buried with specific rituals that invoked the gods and ensured the treasure's protection. One of the most famous examples of a Viking hoard to be discovered in modern times is the Galloway Hoard, found in Scotland in 2014. This collection of artifacts, buried around 900 CE, contains a wealth of Viking treasure, including silver ingots, jewelry, and coins, as well as items of great cultural significance. The hoard was carefully buried, with the items arranged in a manner that suggests deliberate intent. Experts believe that the treasure was hidden by a Viking leader or warrior who wanted to safeguard his wealth from potential enemies. The discovery of the Galloway hoard not only provided a glimpse into the material wealth of the Vikings, but also shed light on the rituals and practices surrounding treasure burial. Similarly, the discovery of Viking burial sites across Scandinavia has revealed a wealth of treasures hidden alongside the bodies of kings, queens, and warriors. These burials were often elaborate affairs, with the deceased accompanied by weapons, shields, and ornaments, as well as valuable objects intended to help them in the afterlife. Many of these treasures were buried with the belief that they would carry the spirit of the dead into the next world, ensuring their protection and prosperity in the realm of the gods. In some cases, the treasures buried alongside the dead were intended as a form of tribute to the gods, to ensure that the deceased would be welcomed into Valhalla or to secure divine favor. But despite the many hoards that have been discovered, there are still countless Viking treasures that remain hidden. It is likely that the Vikings buried their wealth in remote locations, hidden deep within forests, beneath rivers, or even in the hills and mountains of their homeland. These treasures, scattered across the Viking world, have yet to be uncovered. Some may never be found, lost to time and the ravages of nature. Others, however, could still be waiting to be discovered, buried in places that only those with the right knowledge or the right tools will be able to access. The quest for these hidden treasures has inspired countless expeditions, from the early treasure hunters of the 19th century to modern archaeologists and adventurers. Some have succeeded in uncovering treasures of great historical and cultural value, while others have disappeared into the pages of forgotten history, their fates tied to the same myths that surround the treasures they sought. The desire to find these hoards is driven by more than just the promise of wealth. It is fueled by the allure of mystery, the thrill of the unknown, and the hope that a long-lost secret might be revealed. Yet, even as these treasures are uncovered, they often raise more questions than answers. What did these treasures represent to the Vikings? Were they simply objects of personal wealth, or did they hold deeper significance, tied to the spiritual beliefs and cultural practices of the Viking world? And if these treasures were indeed buried with such purpose, what did the Vikings hope to achieve by hiding them? Were they protecting their wealth from enemies, or were they ensuring that their treasures would be safeguarded for future generations, perhaps even beyond the mortal realm? The legends of buried Viking treasure are far more than just stories of greed and conquest. They are reflections of the Viking worldview, which was deeply connected to the forces of fate, the gods, and the afterlife. The treasures they buried were not simply about material gain. They were part of a larger ritual, a way to ensure that their power, their wealth, and their legacy would live on long after they were gone. The Vikings believed that treasure had the power to transcend time, to connect the mortal world with the divine. The very act of hiding treasure was an act of faith, a belief that their wealth would endure, that their legacy would survive, and that their spirit would continue to shape the world even after their death. The story of Viking treasure is a story of the past reaching out to the future, of wealth and power that were never meant to be forgotten. These treasures, whether real or mythic, speak to a world that understood the value of legacy, of family, and of the sacredness of wealth. The Vikings may have hidden their treasure, but they did so not out of fear of losing it, but because they believed it was their right to ensure it was passed on only to those who could truly understand its value. The true treasure of the Vikings was not simply what was buried in the earth, but the legacy they left behind. A legacy that still captivates us today, inspiring us to search for the lost riches of the past, and to uncover the secrets they left behind. The mystery surrounding Viking treasure hoards goes beyond their mythical status in sagas and folklore. Historians and archaeologists have spent decades searching for these riches, trying to unravel the truth hidden within the tales of golden rings, sacred relics, and ancient coins. But while the myths paint a picture of treasures buried by powerful kings and warriors to protect them from thieves or to ensure they would be passed down to worthy heirs, the true story is far more complicated and intriguing. What if the treasure was never meant to be found at all? What if these treasures, believed to be buried for safekeeping or as a final offering to the gods, were deliberately hidden to obscure the past, to erase traces of the Vikings' legacy for reasons unknown? To understand this possibility, we must look at the Vikings' relationship with treasure in a deeper, more nuanced way. Treasure was not simply an object of material wealth to them. It was, in many cases, something far more sacred. The idea of treasure, especially when it came to hoards or objects buried with the dead, was deeply intertwined with their spiritual beliefs. To the Vikings, wealth was a conduit to power, yes, but also a way to establish their place in the afterlife. A Viking who died in battle might be buried with his sword, his shield, and his armor, but also with valuable artifacts, items that had been treasured in life and would presumably accompany him in the next. These items, sacred in their own right, were as much about their spiritual journey as they were about earthly wealth. The burial of treasure, then, was not only a display of power but a way of ensuring divine favor in the afterlife. Consider the example of the Oseberg ship burial, one of the most significant Viking archaeological discoveries. The burial, which dates back to around 834 CE, contained a wealth of artifacts, including a stunningly crafted wooden ship, textiles, jewelry, and ceremonial objects. But what stands out in this find is not just the material wealth, but the care and attention given to the burial process. The ship, the prized possession of the deceased, was a symbol of the journey ahead, a vessel for crossing into the afterlife. The treasure buried with the individual was a reflection of their place in the world, their status, and their connection to the divine. It was not merely meant to be plunder or stolen wealth. It was an offering, a tribute to the gods. But this idea of wealth as a spiritual bridge to the afterlife raises further questions. Could the Vikings have buried treasure for a reason far more profound than personal or familial gain? Could it be that they buried their wealth in the earth not just to protect it from thieves but to obscure its existence, to hide it from future generations, and perhaps even from their own descendants? This notion might seem strange at first, but consider the context of Viking society. Their beliefs were steeped in fatalism and the idea of destiny. Everything, from their birth to their death, was part of a grand design. The idea of treasure being hidden deliberately, left buried for centuries, speaks to their sense of the impermanence of the material world. It wasn't just about taking wealth to the afterlife. It was about leaving behind only what was necessary, what would truly survive the passage of time. The idea of deliberately hiding treasure also aligns with the Vikings' understanding of the power of secrecy. In Viking sagas, secrecy and deception were often portrayed as virtues, tools that could be used to gain the upper hand in battle, politics, and even relationships. This was a culture that knew the value of keeping secrets, whether it was the location of a valuable treasure or the details of a planned raid. To hide treasure was to control its fate. Perhaps some Vikings believed that wealth, especially treasure that had been collected through conquest or trade, should not fall into the wrong hands, even after their death. Perhaps they feared that their descendants would misuse it, or that it would be lost to time, its power diminished or corrupted. Take, for instance, the case of the Viking Age's end. As Christianity spread throughout Scandinavia, the older Norse beliefs were gradually replaced by the Christian worldview, which placed less importance on treasure as a means to influence the divine. The Vikings were a people who lived on the edge of two worlds, balancing their pagan beliefs with the influences of the new Christian order. The rise of Christianity in the Viking world may have been one of the key factors that influenced the hiding of treasure. As the Vikings adopted Christianity, they may have turned their backs on their old ways, seeing the gold and sacred relics of their pagan past as something to be hidden or discarded, a practice that might have been perceived as pagan by their new Christian faith. This shift could explain why some treasure hoards were deliberately buried or lost. The Vikings may have wished to distance themselves from their pagan heritage, hiding their treasures not only from the invading forces but also from their own people, who were increasingly turning to Christianity. In this sense, treasure was not just a commodity to be hoarded or passed down. It was also a symbol of their old beliefs, and thus, it had to be buried with the past. The idea that Vikings could have deliberately hidden treasure also extends to their relationships with foreign cultures. The Vikings were great traders, mercenaries, and explorers, but they were also keenly aware of the value of secrecy. Whether it was the Byzantine Empire, the Slavic kingdoms, or the Islamic world, the Vikings often found themselves in contact with cultures that were as rich in knowledge as they were in wealth. It's possible that some of their treasures, particularly those acquired during their travels, were kept secret as a way of maintaining control over their economic and cultural power. Perhaps they hid some of their most valuable spoils to keep them from the hands of rival groups, or as a way to preserve their knowledge of the world. One of the most fascinating aspects of Viking treasure is that many of these hoards are still missing. While some treasures have been discovered, many more remain hidden beneath the earth or in the depths of the sea, waiting to be uncovered. The Viking Age may have ended centuries ago, but its riches, its secrets, still endure in the myths and the mysteries they left behind. Treasure hunters continue to search for the lost hoards, driven not only by the allure of material wealth, but by the idea that these treasures might hold the key to understanding Viking history and culture in ways we have yet to fully grasp. Could these treasures, buried deep in the earth, be a way of preserving the memory of the Viking world? A world that was on the brink of transition when the Christian faith began to take hold? Were they buried with the hope that, one day, someone would come to understand their significance, to unlock the secrets that the Vikings had hidden so carefully away? The treasures of the Vikings may be lost, but their story, the story of their treasures, their beliefs, and their connections to the past, continues to captivate us, urging us to search deeper into the mysteries of their world. As we continue to unearth Viking treasure, both literal and metaphorical, we begin to realize that the true treasure of the Vikings was not just what they left behind in gold and jewels, but in the questions they left unanswered, the mysteries they left for us to unravel. The treasure is not just buried in the earth, but in the story of the Vikings themselves, a story that continues to be written, one discovery at a time. And perhaps, the greatest treasure of all is the quest for knowledge, the journey into the past that reveals more about the Vikings and about ourselves. The quest for Viking treasure has inspired generations of explorers, archaeologists, and treasure hunters, each captivated by the promise of wealth and the allure of uncovering the lost secrets of a civilization that once spanned vast territories. As much as Viking treasure is celebrated for its beauty, its significance lies not just in its material value, but in the way it reveals the broader story of the Vikings, a story of exploration, conquest, and the complex cultural dynamics that define their world. To understand why Viking treasure is so elusive, we must first consider the nature of their society. The Vikings, for all their ferocity in battle and their reputation as seafaring conquerors, were also deeply embedded in a complex social structure. At the heart of their world was the clan, a community defined not only by blood but by the shared pursuit of wealth and power. It was within these clans that the idea of treasure, whether material or spiritual, was most fully realized. Treasure was not just a means of acquiring wealth. It was a symbol of status, influence, and the favor of the gods. One of the most significant sources of Viking treasure came from their raids. The Vikings' infamous invasions of England, France, and other parts of Europe were not just for pillaging, but for securing resources that would empower them in their own land. As they traveled further from their homelands, they encountered cultures with wealth beyond anything they had seen before. The Vikings returned with gold, silver, and exotic goods, but the real value of these items lay in the power they conferred upon the Vikings. A Viking chief who returned from a successful raid could use his newfound wealth to bolster his position, reward his followers, and cement his influence in the clan. However, treasure wasn't just plundered. It was also a product of Viking craftsmanship. The Vikings were extraordinary artisans, renowned for their ability to work with metals, wood, and stone. Weapons, armor, jewelry, and even the ships they sailed were crafted with great care and skill. Viking swords, in particular, were considered treasures in their own right, not just for their effectiveness in battle, but for their intricate design and craftsmanship. Each sword was a symbol of the warrior's strength and status, and some were even believed to be imbued with magical properties. This connection between treasure and personal identity was central to the Viking way of life, where an individual's worth was often measured by the wealth they accumulated and the items they could claim as their own. Yet, despite the vast riches the Vikings accumulated, much of their treasure is either lost to history or buried beneath the earth, hidden away for reasons that remain largely speculative. The reasons behind this hidden wealth are as varied as the Vikings themselves. Some hoards may have been buried as a way of ensuring their survival against the ravages of time and war. Others may have been hidden to safeguard them from falling into the hands of invaders or rivals. And some treasures may have been concealed for more personal reasons, to ensure that they were passed down to worthy heirs or kept safe for a time when they would be needed most. It is also possible that some of the treasure hoards were deliberately concealed as part of a ritualistic or religious practice. The Vikings were deeply spiritual people, and their religious beliefs often intersected with their understanding of treasure. Many of their treasures were not simply material wealth, but sacred objects that had spiritual significance. Weapons and shields were believed to be imbued with the power of the gods, and treasures were often buried with the dead to accompany them in the afterlife. The idea that treasure could serve as a bridge between the mortal world and the divine was a deeply held belief among the Vikings. In this context, the treasure was not just something to be hoarded, but something to be protected, hidden from view, perhaps until the right time or the right person came along to claim it. The idea of hidden treasure also reflects the Vikings' understanding of fate and destiny. To the Norse people, life was governed by the will of the gods, and the idea of treasure being hidden away by fate or divine intervention was a powerful concept. Many of the greatest hoards were believed to be concealed for reasons beyond human understanding, hidden in places where only the worthy or the fated could uncover them. This sense of destiny, of treasure waiting to be discovered by those who were destined to find it, is a recurring theme in Viking sagas and myths. The treasures the Vikings buried were not just material objects, but symbols of the gods' will, and their discovery was seen as a sign of favor. The Viking world was also a place of constant flux, where power was in a constant state of negotiation and redefinition. Clans and kingdoms rose and fell with startling frequency, and treasure was often a means by which a leader could assert his dominance. Wealth gave a leader the power to raise armies, build alliances, and establish influence over vast territories. But when a leader died, his treasure was often lost, either buried with him or passed down to heirs who might not have the power or desire to use it effectively. In this sense, treasure was as much about the assertion of power as it was about the accumulation of wealth. The very act of hiding treasure, then, could be a form of political maneuvering, a way to ensure that the wealth of the Vikings was protected for future generations or preserved for a time when it would be needed to regain lost power. As much as treasure was tied to the Vikings' material success, it was equally tied to their sense of identity and their legacy. The Vikings were a people obsessed with the idea of legacy, of carving their names into the annals of history. They sought treasure not just for its value, but for the way it would cement their place in the world. The treasures they hoarded and buried were not just personal possessions. They were part of a larger story, the story of their people, their gods, and their eternal struggle to leave a mark on history. In this sense, the treasure was as much a symbol of their cultural memory as it was a source of wealth. It was a way for the Vikings to assert their place in the cosmos and to ensure that their stories would be remembered. The search for Viking treasure, both ancient and lost, continues to this day. As more and more discoveries are made, whether it's through the unearthing of hoards, the finding of shipwrecks, or the decoding of ancient texts, we gain a clearer picture of the Vikings and their world. Yet, the true nature of their treasures remains elusive, with some hoards yet to be discovered and others perhaps lost forever to the ravages of time. What we do know, however, is that the treasures they left behind were more than just gold and silver. They were symbols of their power, their faith, and their legacy. They were not just wealth, they were a testament to the enduring spirit of the Viking people, a spirit that continues to captivate and inspire us today. In many ways, the treasure we seek is not just buried beneath the earth or hidden in long-forgotten tombs, but within the stories themselves. The true treasure of the Vikings is their enduring legacy, a legacy built not just on wealth, but on their unrelenting quest for adventure, knowledge, and a place in history. The Vikings left behind not just material riches, but a cultural inheritance that continues to shape our understanding of the past. And perhaps, in the end, the greatest treasure they left behind is the story we continue to tell. A story that, like the treasures they hid, has yet to be fully uncovered. The search for Viking treasure has always carried with it a sense of mystique and allure, a feeling that beneath the surface of historical records and archaeological sites lies something far more captivating than simple gold and silver. In many ways, the treasures the Vikings amassed tell a story not just of conquest and adventure, but of the complexity and richness of their culture, their spirituality, and their worldview. To understand why these treasures remain so compelling, we must look beyond the simple pursuit of wealth and explore the deeper meanings they held for the Vikings themselves. At the heart of the Viking treasure hunt lies a paradox. While the Vikings were known for their ability to acquire vast amounts of treasure through raids, trade, and conquest, they were also a people who understood the transience of wealth. For the Vikings, treasure was not simply a commodity to be hoarded or spent. It was something that had the power to shape their fates, both in life and death. The very idea of treasure was tied to the belief that the gods controlled the destiny of all things, including wealth. Treasure was therefore not just about acquiring wealth for the sake of material gain. It was about asserting one's place in the world, aligning oneself with the divine, and securing a legacy that would transcend death. This belief in the divine nature of treasure was reflected in the ways that the Vikings treated their hoards. Many of the treasures they collected, whether from foreign lands or from the spoils of battle, were not simply kept for their value in trade or their immediate usefulness. Instead, they were treated as sacred objects, imbued with meaning and power. Viking warriors believed that the weapons and artifacts they carried into battle were not only tools of war but also symbols of their connection to the gods. These items were often passed down through generations, and the most treasured artifacts were treated with reverence, almost as if they were living beings with their own will and purpose. The practice of burial also played a significant role in the Vikings' relationship with treasure. When a Viking leader or warrior died, their treasure was often buried with them, placed in their grave as a means of ensuring their continued success in the afterlife. This practice was not unique to the Vikings. Many cultures buried their dead with treasures to accompany them on their journey to the next world. But the Viking version of this practice carried a particular spiritual significance. It was believed that treasure buried with the dead would provide them with the resources they needed to navigate the dangers of the afterlife and gain favor with the gods. For the Vikings, the act of burying treasure was as much about the spiritual journey as it was about the material wealth it represented. The idea of treasure as a tool for securing favor with the gods also extended to the practice of offerings. The Vikings believed that treasure had the power to influence the gods, to shape the course of events, and to change the outcomes of battles. This belief was deeply ingrained in their worldview, and many Viking leaders used treasure as a way of cementing their relationships with the divine. Gifts of treasure were often made to the gods in exchange for protection, victory in battle, or even the favor of the gods in the afterlife. These offerings were not simply a matter of appeasing the gods. They were a way of asserting one's power and position in the cosmic order, of ensuring that the gods would take notice and grant their blessings. But the connection between treasure and divine favor was not just about the physical objects themselves. It was also about the rituals and practices surrounding treasure. The Vikings were deeply connected to their religious beliefs, and their treasures were often imbued with symbolic meaning. Weapons, shields, and other artifacts were treated as sacred objects that could carry the favor of the gods and bring protection to their owners. These items were not simply possessions. They were powerful talismans, believed to hold a divine essence that could influence the course of events. This belief in the magical power of treasure is evident in many of the Viking sagas, where heroes often seek out mystical weapons or artifacts to give them an advantage in battle or to protect them from harm. In this sense, the Vikings' treasures were not just material possessions. They were part of a larger, spiritual framework that defined their worldview. Treasure was not simply a means of acquiring wealth or power. It was a means of securing one's place in the world and aligning oneself with the forces of fate. This belief in the power of treasure extended beyond the individual to the larger community. A Viking leader who amassed great wealth was not just a wealthy man. He was a figure of power, someone who could secure the future of his clan and ensure that his people would prosper. The treasures he accumulated were not just for his personal gain. They were for the good of his people, a way of asserting their collective strength and identity. However, as much as treasure was seen as a means of securing power and favor, it was also understood to be a fleeting and impermanent force. The Vikings, like many ancient peoples, had a deep awareness of the fragility of life. Wealth could be gained, but it could just as easily be lost. The cycle of gain and loss, of success and failure, was central to the Viking experience. Many Viking hoards were buried not just to protect them from enemies but to preserve them for a future generation. Some treasures may have been hidden with the hope that they would be rediscovered at a time when they were needed most. In this sense, treasure was not just about acquiring wealth. It was about ensuring that wealth would endure, that it would survive the ravages of time and the changing tides of fate. This concept of treasure as something that transcended the material world is reflected in the way the Vikings viewed their legacy. To a Viking, treasure was not just a symbol of wealth. It was a symbol of immortality. The treasures they amassed, whether in the form of gold, silver, or sacred relics, were seen as a way of ensuring their place in history. The Vikings were obsessed with leaving a lasting mark on the world, and treasure was one way to achieve that goal. A leader who amassed a great hoard of treasure could secure his place in the saga of his people, ensuring that his name would be remembered for generations. In this sense, treasure was more than just a commodity. It was a way of securing a form of immortality, a way of ensuring that one's actions and achievements would live on long after death. This obsession with legacy and immortality is also reflected in the way the Vikings treated their burial sites. Many Viking graves contained not just the bodies of the deceased, but also a wealth of treasures, symbols of their power and status in life. These graves were often monumental, designed to reflect the importance of the individual and their place in the cosmic order. The treasures buried with the dead were not just for the deceased. They were for the living as well, a way of honoring the legacy of those who had passed and ensuring that their memory would live on. In this sense, the treasure of the Vikings was not just about wealth or material gain. It was about something much larger. It was about the creation of a legacy, the assertion of power, and the desire to transcend the limitations of the mortal world. The treasures they accumulated were symbols of their place in history, markers of their strength and their connection to the divine. And while the treasures they left behind may have been buried and lost over time, the legacy they created continues to captivate us today. The treasure of the Vikings was not just gold or silver. It was the story they told, a story that continues to resonate and inspire. As modern archaeological digs continue to uncover the buried remnants of Viking culture, the stories of treasure hoards and the mysteries surrounding them remain as potent as ever. From the shores of England to the frozen landscapes of Scandinavia, treasure hunters and historians alike remain drawn to the idea that something valuable, something significant, lies hidden beneath the earth. The search for Viking treasure has become a pursuit almost as legendary as the treasures themselves. Yet, while we uncover more and more relics, gold and silver, rings and swords, remnants of long-forgotten hoards, there is still a sense that these treasures tell only part of the story. The treasures we find may offer us glimpses into Viking life, but the deeper question remains: why did the Vikings value treasure so intensely, and why did they hide it in the first place? The very act of hiding treasure suggests a deep understanding of loss and preservation. For a people as skilled in warfare as the Vikings were, it seems curious that they would bury or conceal their wealth, as if in fear of something beyond mere physical threat. In many ways, this hiding of treasure reflects the cultural and spiritual complexities of Viking society. For the Vikings, wealth wasn't just something to be spent or fought over. It was a means of influencing fate itself, of shaping the world around them. Their treasures, particularly those gathered from foreign lands, were believed to hold not just material value but metaphysical power. To bury or hide a treasure wasn't simply a matter of protecting it from thieves or enemies. It was an act of controlling its destiny, of ensuring it could only be wielded by those deemed worthy or fated to find it. This notion of destiny and the unseen hand of fate plays a large role in understanding Viking treasure. The Vikings, like many ancient cultures, lived in a world governed by forces beyond human control. The gods, spirits, and the natural world all had a direct influence on their lives. Treasure was not simply a byproduct of wealth or conquest. It was a tool to influence the divine, a way of securing favor and ensuring that the future was shaped according to the will of the gods. This idea was so ingrained in Viking culture that treasure was often seen not as something to be hoarded, but as something to be hidden away for a time, waiting for the right moment or the right individual to come along and claim it. In this sense, treasure could be viewed as a gift or a test, a reward for those who had proven themselves worthy of the god's favor, or perhaps a test to see if the right person would rise to the occasion. Another fascinating aspect of Viking treasure is how it reveals the Vikings' relationship with their own past and their changing worldview. The Viking Age was marked by a transition from a pagan belief system to a Christian one, a shift that had profound implications on how treasure was viewed. In the early Viking period, treasure was an essential part of the warrior ethos. Gold and silver were symbols of power, victory, and status, and they were often displayed or shared as a way of cementing alliances or demonstrating strength. However, as Christianity spread throughout Scandinavia, the value of treasure began to shift. The once sacred relics, such as idols and amulets, began to lose their spiritual significance. The gods of the Norse pantheon, once at the heart of Viking belief, were gradually replaced by the Christian God, and with that shift came a reevaluation of what treasure truly represented. For many Vikings, treasure became increasingly seen as a means of demonstrating earthly power rather than spiritual connection. As Viking society began to adopt Christian ideals, the idea of hoarding treasure for the afterlife lost some of its importance. The burial of treasure with the dead, which had once been a deeply spiritual practice, began to take on a more secular meaning. No longer were these hoards viewed as essential items for the afterlife. Instead, they were seen as a symbol of wealth and influence. This shift in perspective is evident in the burial practices that evolved throughout the Viking Age. While early Viking burials were lavish and rich with treasures designed to honor the gods, later burials became more practical and less ornate. It's almost as though the treasure, once viewed as sacred, became a symbol of the old ways, something to be hidden away and left behind, perhaps as a final connection to the past. The changing role of treasure in Viking culture also reflected broader shifts in Viking society itself. As the Vikings transitioned from a society of raiders to one of settlers and traders, the meaning of treasure began to evolve. The early Vikings were driven by the need for material wealth, as it gave them the resources to build ships, raise armies, and dominate their enemies. But as they established settlements in places like Iceland, Greenland, and even North America, treasure became something that could be used to establish legitimacy, secure alliances, and support long-term goals. In this new context, treasure was no longer just a means of showing strength in battle. It became an essential tool for navigating the complexities of governance and diplomacy. However, even as the Vikings settled into these new roles, the belief that treasure held more than just material value persisted. For example, the great hoards found buried in Scandinavian burial mounds weren't just a display of wealth. They were also offerings to the gods, or at least to the memory of the dead. These treasures were a way of securing protection from the divine or ensuring that the dead could be properly equipped for the afterlife. Many Viking graves contained not just coins and jewelry, but also items that were meant to provide spiritual guidance or protection. For the Vikings, treasure was a complex and multifaceted concept, tied to both the material world and the divine. But why, despite this changing view of treasure, did so many Viking hoards remain hidden for centuries? Why did the Vikings continue to bury their wealth in secret locations, sometimes in places that seemed deliberately difficult to reach? Was it simply out of fear of invasion, or did the Vikings believe their treasures were better off hidden from the world? Some historians suggest that the Vikings' relationship with their treasures was as much about memory and legacy as it was about wealth. The Vikings were a people deeply concerned with their place in history, and their treasures were a means of securing that place. By burying their wealth, they ensured that it would not be squandered or lost to time. The treasure was, in a sense, an insurance policy for future generations, a way to ensure that the legacy of the Vikings would be preserved, even if the world around them changed. Others believe that the treasure hoards left behind by the Vikings were, in fact, part of a much larger, grander plan. As the Vikings' influence spread across Europe and beyond, their wealth became intertwined with the global trade networks that spanned from the Mediterranean to the farthest reaches of Russia and the Americas. In this sense, Viking treasure may have been part of a larger strategy, a way to establish the Vikings' presence in foreign lands, to protect their interests, and to guarantee their future success. The treasure hoards were not just relics of the past. They were part of a much larger vision for the Viking world, a world where wealth and influence could be traded, hidden, and passed down through generations. The mystery surrounding Viking treasure, and the reasons for its concealment, speaks to the heart of what it meant to be a Viking. For the Vikings, treasure was not merely an object to be collected. It was a symbol of their power, their connection to the divine, and their place in the world. To understand Viking treasure is to understand the complexities of Viking culture. A culture that valued not just wealth, but the ability to shape fate, to influence the gods, and to secure a legacy that would endure long after death. The treasure hidden by the Vikings was more than just material wealth. It was a part of their identity, their mythology, and their worldview. And even as we continue to unearth it, the mystery remains. What did these treasures truly mean to the Vikings? What did they hope to achieve by hiding them away? The answers may be lost to history, but the quest to uncover them continues to captivate and intrigue us. The ongoing search for Viking treasure continues to captivate the imagination, not just because of the potential wealth it promises, but because of the deep sense of mystery and hidden knowledge that seems to surround these hoards. As we dig into the dirt and sift through the remnants of Viking life, we often wonder, what drove them to hide their wealth so carefully? Was it simply a matter of safeguarding gold and precious artifacts? Or was there something deeper at play, something rooted in their spirituality, culture, and understanding of destiny? At its core, Viking treasure wasn't simply material wealth. It was a symbol of their power, their connection to the divine, and their very identity as a people. For the Vikings, treasure had a dual purpose. It was both a means of asserting control over their mortal world and a way of securing favor with the gods in the afterlife. This relationship with treasure was intertwined with their beliefs about fate, honor, and the cyclical nature of life and death. The Vikings saw themselves as living in a world ruled by forces far beyond their control, where gods and fate determined the course of events. And yet, treasure offered them a way to influence these forces, to alter the path of destiny and ensure that their legacy would endure long after they were gone. This dual nature of treasure, both earthly and spiritual, is crucial to understanding the way the Vikings viewed wealth. It wasn't just about what treasure could buy or what it represented in terms of status. It was about the power that treasure held over life and death. For many Vikings, treasure wasn't just hoarded for its material value, but for its potential to protect them in the afterlife or to secure divine favor in times of need. When a Viking warrior died in battle, it was often believed that his treasures would accompany him on his journey to Valhalla, where the gods would reward him for his bravery. The act of burying treasure, then, was not just an offering to the gods. It was a way of ensuring that the deceased would be equipped for the trials of the afterlife, that they would be able to fight alongside the gods in the great battles to come. But what of the treasure that was hidden away, buried with no clear purpose or explanation? What does it mean that so many Viking hoards were left untouched for centuries, sometimes in the most remote and difficult-to-reach places? One of the most intriguing aspects of Viking treasure is the mystery of its concealment. Some hoards were buried so well that their discovery was accidental, or, in some cases, never realized. Was this a deliberate act of hiding treasure to keep it out of the hands of invaders? Or was there something more profound at work? The idea that treasure might have been hidden for future generations, perhaps in the hope that it would be discovered when it was needed most, suggests a deep understanding of the impermanence of material wealth. It implies that the Vikings saw their treasure not as something that could be owned forever, but as something that was meant to endure the test of time, to survive beyond the reach of mortal hands, and to be rediscovered when its purpose had come full circle. In this sense, the act of hiding treasure becomes a kind of ritual, a way of ensuring that the wealth would not be wasted, that it would not fall into the hands of those who were unworthy. It's a powerful commentary on the Vikings' belief in fate and the idea of destiny. Treasure, to them, was not a possession to be freely traded or spent, but a powerful symbol of their connection to the gods, to the forces of fate, and to their legacy. By burying their treasure, they were leaving behind a tangible link to their past, a way to ensure that their story would live on, even if their wealth was no longer in circulation. The hoards of treasure buried across the Viking world serve as silent witnesses to this belief, preserved in the earth for centuries, waiting for someone worthy enough to find them. The notion of worthy individuals and divine favor is critical to understanding the hidden treasures of the Vikings. To be worthy wasn't simply about having the strength to defeat an enemy or the cunning to outmaneuver a rival. It was about the ability to navigate the complexities of fate and destiny, to recognize the importance of legacy, and to honor the gods who controlled the flow of life and death. For the Vikings, treasure was something to be earned, not simply acquired. It was a reward for bravery, for loyalty, for fulfilling one's duty to the gods and to one's people. Treasure wasn't just handed out. It was earned through actions and sacrifices, through the living of a life worthy of the gods' favor. This sense of earning treasure, of proving oneself worthy, is reflected in many of the sagas and myths that have come down to us from the Viking Age. Heroes in these stories are often tested, not just in battle, but in their ability to make difficult choices, to face their fears, and to live with honor. The treasures they gain are a reflection of their worthiness, a sign that they have passed these tests and earned the right to claim the riches they have gathered. The treasure hoards left behind by the Vikings, then, can be seen as a reflection of the culture they created, a culture that placed great value on honor, bravery, and legacy. These hoards were not just collections of wealth. They were part of a larger system of values that guided the Vikings in their daily lives. The act of burying treasure was not just about safeguarding wealth. It was about ensuring that those who came after them would understand the significance of what was left behind, that they would appreciate the connection between wealth and honor, between the material world and the spiritual one. As historians and archaeologists continue to uncover Viking hoards, the mysteries surrounding them only seem to deepen. What we find in these buried treasures is often more than just gold and silver. We find artifacts of immense cultural significance, swords engraved with intricate patterns, shields bearing the marks of gods, and jewelry crafted with great care and skill. These items tell us about the Vikings' craftsmanship, their values, and their worldview. They reveal a culture that understood the deep connections between wealth, honor, and the divine, and one that was committed to ensuring that its treasures were not just passed down, but preserved for future generations. The very fact that so many of these treasures remain hidden, lost to time, or locked away beneath the earth, adds to the sense of mystery surrounding the Vikings. These hoards are not just relics of the past. They are keys to understanding the minds and hearts of a people whose world was defined by the forces of fate and destiny. In uncovering these treasures, we are not just rediscovering lost wealth. We are reconnecting with the spiritual and cultural beliefs that shaped Viking society. We are beginning to understand the profound role that treasure played in their lives, not just as a symbol of material wealth, but as a means of ensuring that their legacy would endure, that their place in the world would be remembered, and that the favor of the gods would always be with them. As we continue to uncover these treasures, we find ourselves drawn not just to the wealth they represent, but to the questions they raise. What did these treasures mean to the Vikings? Why did they bury them, and what did they hope to achieve by doing so? The treasure of the Vikings is not just a symbol of their wealth. It is a symbol of their legacy, their beliefs, and their place in the grand tapestry of history. The treasure they left behind, whether discovered or still hidden, continues to be a beacon, guiding us deeper into the mysteries of the Viking world. The Vikings were a people who both revered and feared the forces of fate, and nowhere is this more apparent than in their relationship with treasure. While treasure was seen as a tool for power and influence, it was also understood as something fragile, something that could easily slip from one's grasp if not properly safeguarded. To understand why Viking treasure was often buried, hidden, or left untouched for centuries, we must consider the worldview of the Vikings, a worldview that saw treasure not just as a material good but as something tied to the whims of the gods and the inevitable march of fate. At the heart of Viking society was the idea of WYRD, a concept that was similar to fate or destiny, but with a more fluid, almost mystical quality. The Vikings believed that WYRD governed the events of their lives, shaping their actions and outcomes in ways that were beyond their control. The gods, too, were part of this larger cosmic design, and it was through their favor or disfavor that the course of one's life would be determined. The gods themselves were unpredictable, and while they could bless someone with treasure, power, or glory, they could just as easily withdraw their favor, leading to a rapid fall from grace. For the Vikings, Treasure wasn't just a material asset. It was a reflection of the divine will, and the discovery, possession, or loss of treasure was believed to be a direct manifestation of the god's favor or wrath. This understanding of treasure as something more than just a physical object explains why the Vikings often went to great lengths to hide it. When a treasure was buried or concealed, it was as much about protecting it from divine intervention as it was about protecting it from thieves or invaders. There was an understanding that treasure, in all its forms, could easily be lost or taken away if the gods were not favorable. But in hiding it, the Vikings were exercising control over their destiny, at least for a time. They ensured that their wealth would not fall into the hands of those unworthy or beyond their control. Treasure was not simply meant to be passed around or displayed openly. It was something to be kept secret, to be hidden away until the right person or the right time arrived to claim it. This belief in treasure as something that could be controlled, hoarded, and hidden as part of a divine plan is evident in many of the sagas and myths that have been passed down through the ages. In the Icelandic sagas, for example, treasure is often seen as a symbol of both personal and cosmic power. Warriors who earn great treasure are often depicted as being in the favor of the gods, while those who lose their wealth are frequently shown as having fallen out of grace with the divine. These sagas portray treasure not just as a physical possession but as a link between the mortal and divine realms, a way of communicating with the gods and ensuring that their favor remains. This connection between treasure and the gods also reflects the Vikings' belief in the cyclical nature of life, death, and rebirth. Treasure was not something that could be hoarded forever. It was something to be passed down, to be lost and rediscovered, to be used as a way of perpetuating one's legacy and ensuring that one's name would be remembered by future generations. The Vikings believed in an afterlife where warriors who had proven themselves in battle would be welcomed into Valhalla, the great hall of the slain. But this afterlife was not guaranteed. It had to be earned. Treasure played a role in this belief. The treasures buried with the dead were meant to accompany them into the next life, ensuring that they were well-equipped for the challenges that lay ahead. Some hoards were buried in graves with the hope that they would provide the deceased with the strength and tools necessary to navigate the afterlife and gain favor with the gods. These treasures were not just material objects. They were believed to be imbued with spiritual significance, capable of influencing one's fate in the afterlife. The idea that treasure could play a role in shaping the journey to Valhalla shows just how deeply intertwined the concepts of treasure and fate were in Viking culture. But the Vikings were also practical people, and they understood the transient nature of life. Even as they revered the spiritual aspects of treasure, they knew that it was something that had to be protected in the real world. This practical side of treasure hunting can be seen in the way Vikings carefully hid their wealth. Many hoards were buried in places where only those with the right knowledge would be able to find them, in remote locations, hidden beneath rocks or within secret caves. Some treasures were buried in such a way that they could only be recovered by a person with the proper skill or understanding. This was not just a practical measure. It was a symbolic one as well. The act of burying treasure in a hidden place reflected the Vikings' belief that treasure had a divine purpose, and that only those with the right qualities, the right honor, bravery, or spiritual connection, would be worthy enough to uncover it. For the Vikings, treasure was tied not only to the gods but to the very fabric of their society. The accumulation of treasure signified a person's status and power, but it was also a way of asserting one's authority within the clan or tribe. A warrior who returned with a hoard of treasure could secure his position as a leader, a protector of his people, and a provider for his family. Treasure was a way of demonstrating one's worth, of proving one's ability to command respect and loyalty. But with that power came the potential for betrayal and rivalry. Treasure could be a source of conflict, as those who sought to gain power might be willing to do anything, including betraying their comrades, to get their hands on it. This is perhaps why the Vikings were so careful about how they hid their wealth. Treasure wasn't just about wealth or power. It was a symbol of everything the Vikings held dear: their bravery, their honor, and their ability to control their destiny. And as much as it represented their achievements, treasure also embodied the constant threat of betrayal, loss, and the unpredictable whims of fate. The Viking practice of hiding treasure can also be seen as a reflection of their complex relationship with their own history. The Vikings were a people who lived in a world of constant change. A world where empires rose and fell, where kingdoms were constantly at war, and where one's position could shift in an instant. To bury treasure was, in a sense, to safeguard a part of that history. Treasure was a link to the past, a symbol of the accomplishments and sacrifices of those who came before. By hiding treasure, the Vikings ensured that their legacy would not be easily erased by time or conflict. The hoards that have been uncovered in modern times offer us a glimpse into this past, providing insight into a world that was far removed from our own. And yet, in many ways, these treasures are still connected to us, speaking across the centuries about the values, fears, and hopes of a people who believed that their fate was tied to something much larger than themselves. The burial of treasure also speaks to the Vikings' view of time and their understanding of the future. The hoards they left behind were not just meant to benefit those who lived at the time. They were meant to serve as a reminder for future generations. The act of hiding treasure was a way of ensuring that the Vikings' legacy would endure, that their story would be remembered long after they had gone. Some treasure hoards, for instance, might have been hidden by those who anticipated their own downfall or death, hoping that one day their heirs or successors would recover it and use it to restore their family's fortunes. This foresight reveals a kind of pragmatic wisdom among the Vikings, a recognition that treasure, like life itself, is fleeting, and that what is lost may one day be found by those who are destined to reclaim it. The continued discovery of Viking treasure, sometimes in unexpected places, serves as a reminder of the enduring mysteries that surround these ancient people. These treasures are more than just relics of a lost time. They are pieces of a larger puzzle, fragments of a story that we are still trying to piece together. What was the true purpose of all this treasure? Why did the Vikings hide it so carefully, often in locations that defy understanding? The answers may never be fully known, but each new discovery brings us closer to understanding the profound relationship the Vikings had with their wealth, their gods, and their fate. The treasures we find today are more than just objects. They are messages from the past, links to a time when life was defined by struggle, faith, and the unrelenting pursuit of legacy. And though we may never fully understand the reasons behind the hidden hoards of the Vikings, we continue to search for them, compelled by the same curiosity and fascination that has driven treasure hunters for centuries. In many ways, these treasures are a testament to the Vikings' lasting influence on the world, a reminder that even in death, their story endures. Viking treasure is as much about the intangible as it is about the material. As much as the search for gold, silver, and jewels drives modern-day archaeologists, the treasures of the Vikings hold deeper meanings that have less to do with wealth than we might expect. From swords to amulets, shields to drinking horns, Viking treasure was often about more than just the items themselves. They were symbols of gods, warriors, fate, and power. This is why treasure hoards were often buried or hidden, not just to protect them from invaders or thieves, but because they were seen as objects of divine power, whose possession and location had a cosmic significance. The belief in WYRD, the ancient Norse concept of fate, is central to understanding why treasure was both valued and hidden. Unlike in modern times, where treasure is often seen as a means of personal gain, the Vikings understood treasure in a way that was deeply spiritual. The treasures they collected were not simply pieces of wealth, but items that could influence fate. The Vikings believed that treasures were sometimes imbued with the blessings of the gods or spirits. A sword, for example, could be more than just a weapon. It could be a tool of divine judgment. Its blade might carry the power to decide the outcome of a battle or serve as a tool for vengeance in the afterlife. A shield could symbolize protection from malevolent forces or act as a physical manifestation of a warrior's connection to the divine. For a warrior, possessing such a treasure was a sign that the gods had favored him. To be in possession of a magical sword or enchanted armor was to have a divine edge over one's enemies. Many Viking treasures, from jewelry to weapons, were inscribed with symbols of protection or invoked the names of the gods. This was not mere superstition. It was an integral part of Viking life. Their understanding of the world was grounded in the belief that material items, like treasure, could shape their destiny. And so, when these items were buried, hidden, or hoarded, They were treated not as lost possessions but as part of a larger, ongoing story. The Vikings had an acute awareness of the fleeting nature of life and the impermanence of wealth. As raiders and warriors, they lived and fought with the constant threat of death looming over them. A Viking's wealth was often gained in battle through raiding or plundering, and, like the sword that was used to obtain it, the wealth was fleeting. If one fell in battle, that wealth could easily be taken by someone else. But treasure also had a role in death. When a Viking chieftain or warrior died, their possessions were often buried with them. This wasn't just an earthly gesture. It was an act designed to ensure that the deceased was properly equipped to enter the afterlife. The concept of Valhalla, where warriors who died in battle were honored by the gods, was central to Viking death rituals. Treasure, particularly weapons and shields, was often placed in the grave to accompany the deceased on their journey. These items were thought to provide the necessary tools for survival in the afterlife, where the gods would test the warrior's strength and valor. It was not uncommon for treasure to be buried with the hope that it would be used to protect the dead in their passage to Valhalla. These treasures were not just for the benefit of the living. They were meant to ensure that the dead could fight alongside the gods in the great battles of the afterlife. Some of these burial practices may seem strange to us, but they reflect a profound belief in the continuity of life and death, where material wealth and spiritual favor were inextricably linked. The treasure of the deceased, therefore, was not simply buried for future generations to find. It was placed in the ground as part of the Viking warriors' personal passage to the next world, where it would serve as both a testament to their life and a necessary tool for their survival in the afterlife. But what of the treasures that were hidden away, never to be found, or the ones that had no apparent link to burial rites? The vast number of Viking treasure hoards that have been discovered in modern times suggests that there was more to these hoards than mere practicality. These treasures were often hidden in remote locations, buried deep within the earth, or placed in areas difficult to access. Some historians argue that these hidden treasures were meant to be a way of ensuring that the wealth would be available to future generations. A hoard buried in the ground was a means of preserving wealth until it was needed. However, the secrecy of these hoards also suggests that there was a deeper, more spiritual reason for their concealment. Viking society was built on a deep belief in fate and the role of the gods. When treasure was hidden, it was as if the gods themselves had decreed that it was not yet time for it to be revealed. The treasure was meant to be discovered at the right moment, when the fates had aligned and the right individual or group would be worthy of it. The idea that treasure had a destiny of its own, that it could be hidden and revealed at the appropriate time, speaks to the Vikings' complex understanding of the world. Treasure wasn't just something that could be hoarded or passed from one person to another. It was something that was part of a larger cosmic plan. The act of hiding treasure, then, was a way of preserving it for the right moment, when the time was ripe for someone worthy to claim it. This notion that treasure could be hidden for the right person to find is woven throughout Viking mythology. Many of the sagas and tales of Viking heroes are built on the idea of a hidden treasure or a magical artifact that only the worthy could claim. These artifacts, whether they were swords, jewels, or shields, often had powers far beyond their material worth. The hero who found such a treasure was not merely claiming a prize. They were proving themselves worthy of the gods' favor. The treasure was not just a symbol of victory. It was an instrument that could change the course of history, granting the hero the power to defeat enemies, secure alliances, or change the fates of entire kingdoms. There is also the possibility that some of these treasure hoards were meant as a form of cultural legacy. To the Vikings, treasure was a way of securing one's place in history. The idea of being remembered after death, of leaving behind something that would ensure their name lived on, was deeply ingrained in Viking culture. By hiding treasures, they ensured that their wealth would survive through the ages, waiting for a future generation to find it and claim it as their own. In a world where empires rose and fell, and where people often met untimely deaths, the act of preserving treasure was a means of ensuring that one's legacy would endure. Whether for the benefit of future rulers, descendants, or even future generations of warriors, treasure hoards were a way of preserving the past in a material form. They were symbols of power and continuity, waiting to be rediscovered when the time was right. When treasure is found today, often by accident, sometimes after centuries of being buried. It carries with it an immense sense of mystery. What did the Vikings believe about this treasure? Why did they hide it? Was it simply an act of protection, a response to the uncertain, dangerous world they lived in? Or was there something more to these hoards? What they believed about the treasure, and what it meant to them, remains shrouded in mystery. Yet, each new discovery brings us closer to understanding this relationship between treasure, fate, and the gods. As we uncover more and more of the treasures hidden by the Vikings, we begin to piece together a picture of a society whose understanding of the world was as complex and intricate as the treasure hoards they left behind. Even now, as we search the landscape for these treasures, the mystery persists. The treasures we find tell a story not just of wealth, but of a people whose lives were defined by the interplay of fate and fortune, whose understanding of the world transcended the material. The hidden treasures of the Vikings are more than just artifacts. They are keys to understanding the spiritual and cultural world of the people who hid them, and a reminder that history is never as simple as it seems. Every treasure hoard, every buried artifact, carries with it the echoes of a world long past. A world that we continue to uncover, piece by piece, with each new discovery. The search for Viking treasure is as much about uncovering the past as it is about understanding the values and cultural priorities that shaped the Viking Age. As we continue to excavate treasure hoards buried beneath the earth, we are faced with the question of what these hoards truly represent. They are often seen simply as relics of a brutal warrior society, but there is much more to the story. To the Vikings, treasure was not merely wealth to be hoarded, but a symbol of divine favor, a link to their gods, and a tool for shaping their destiny. The treasures they buried were not just objects of earthly value. They were part of a spiritual practice, deeply tied to their understanding of fate, honor, and the afterlife. When the Vikings hid their treasures, it wasn't merely for practical reasons, to safeguard them from enemy invaders or thieves. Their belief system told them that treasure had a life of its own, a force that could shape the course of events. The act of hiding treasure was a way of exercising control over these forces, ensuring that the treasure could not fall into the wrong hands and that its potential would be realized only at the right time. In this sense, treasure was not simply an object to be used. It was something to be protected, hoarded, and respected. The Vikings understood that wealth could easily be lost, and that nothing in life was guaranteed. The hidden treasures they left behind reflect a deep understanding of the impermanence of life, and the desire to control that impermanence, to make sure that wealth and power were passed on to the right people at the right time. For the Vikings, wealth and treasure were also inherently tied to the concepts of fate and honor. To possess treasure was to possess the gods' favor, a sign that one had been chosen, that one's actions aligned with divine will. Treasure was earned through conquest, through violence, through the will of the gods, and as such it came with a weighty responsibility. It was not just something to be squandered, it was something to be honored. For the Vikings, wealth was an extension of their personal honor and the honor of their gods. A man who gained treasure was expected to use it wisely, to show strength and wisdom in wielding it, and to ensure that it was passed on in a manner that would uphold his legacy. This is why Viking treasure was often buried with the deceased, to ensure that it was not wasted, and that it would be used properly in the afterlife. For the warrior, the treasure served as both a symbol of his earthly accomplishments and a tool to secure his place in the divine realm. But the role of treasure was not just about power or status. Treasure was also tied to memory and legacy. The Vikings had a deeply ingrained sense of the importance of storytelling, of ensuring that their deeds would be remembered long after they were gone. Treasure was one of the ways in which they ensured that their legacy would endure. By hiding their treasure, by burying it in secret places, the Vikings ensured that their wealth would not be lost to time. It would be preserved, waiting for future generations to uncover it. This act of preservation was not only a way to protect their wealth, it was a way to ensure that their name, their story, would survive. The hoards left behind were not merely meant to benefit the living, but were designed to endure beyond the lifetime of the individual who buried them. This was a way for the Vikings to make sure that their influence would continue, even after they had passed from this world. The concept of hidden treasure also reflects the Vikings' relationship with time. The Vikings understood that the passage of time was inevitable and that their influence in the world was fleeting. The burying of treasure was an act of defiance against this transience. It was a way of ensuring that their achievements and their wealth would survive through the ages, that they would leave behind something that would not be erased by time. These treasures were a form of insurance, a way of ensuring that their legacy would not be forgotten, even if their empire or kingdom fell. They wanted future generations to rediscover their wealth and, by extension, to rediscover their story. In this sense, treasure wasn't just something they wanted to keep for themselves. It was something they wanted to pass on, something that would outlive them and continue to carry their memory forward. As archaeologists unearth Viking treasure hoards today, they are often struck not just by the material wealth they find, but by the cultural and spiritual significance that wealth represents. Viking treasure hoards are often filled with objects that go beyond mere currency or adornment. Weapons, rings, amulets, and other items were buried alongside gold coins and jewelry, creating a more complex picture of what treasure meant to the Vikings. These hoards were not just about the accumulation of wealth. They were about securing the future, ensuring divine favor, and preserving one's legacy. They were about establishing a connection between the past, present, and future, ensuring that the Vikings' influence would survive long after their civilization faded into history. One of the most intriguing aspects of Viking treasure is its role in their evolving view of the afterlife. The Vikings, like many other ancient cultures, believed that the dead continued to play a significant role in the world of the living. But for the Viking warrior, the afterlife wasn't simply a place of rest. It was an extension of their earthly experiences, where they could continue to demonstrate their strength and valor. To prepare for the afterlife, warriors were often buried with treasures, swords, shields, and helmets, to ensure that they would be fully equipped for the challenges ahead. Treasure was seen not just as a means of survival in the next world, but as a sign of one's worth in this one. A warrior who died with treasure was considered to be in the favor of the gods, a warrior whose bravery and achievements were worthy of divine recognition. This belief in the importance of treasure in the afterlife also speaks to the Viking understanding of death. They saw death not as an end but as a continuation of the cycle of life. The treasures that were buried with the dead were meant to accompany them on their journey to the afterlife, to help them navigate the trials they would face in Valhalla. In this sense, the treasures buried with the dead were not just material possessions. They were tools of spiritual power, providing the deceased with the strength to face the gods and secure their place among the honored dead. The concept of treasure as a bridge between life and death, between the mortal world and the divine, adds another layer to our understanding of why the Vikings hid their treasures. The act of hiding treasure, then, becomes a symbol of the cyclical nature of life and death. The treasures that were buried were not just hidden for the sake of wealth. They were hidden as part of a larger spiritual practice, a way to ensure that the treasures would be discovered when the time was right. These treasures were not meant to be forgotten. They were meant to endure, to remain hidden until they were needed. And when they were rediscovered, it was as though the cycle of fate had come full circle. In modern times, the discovery of Viking treasure continues to capture the imagination. Every new hoard unearthed offers a glimpse into the world of the Vikings, and the items found often carry with them stories of warriors, gods, and the mysteries of the past. But even as we uncover these treasures, we are left with more questions than answers. Why did the Vikings hide their treasure so carefully? Was it an act of reverence toward the gods, or an effort to control their own fate? What did the treasures mean to them, and what role did they play in the larger narrative of Viking society? The mystery of Viking treasure is not simply about the wealth it represents. It is about the spiritual, cultural, and historical significance of that wealth. It is about the belief that treasure was not just a material possession, but a tool that could shape fate, secure divine favor, and ensure that one's legacy would endure. Even as we uncover these treasures, the questions remain. What did the Vikings hope to achieve by hiding their wealth? What did they believe about the nature of fate, the afterlife, and the role of treasure in shaping their world? The answers may never be fully known, but the search for these treasures continues to captivate us, offering us a window into a world that was governed by the complex interplay of power, spirituality, and fate. As we delve deeper into the mysteries of Viking treasure, we must consider not only the material wealth left behind but also the broader implications of what these treasures represent within the cultural and spiritual landscape of the Vikings. The treasures they buried were not simply about gold, silver, or precious jewels. They were the very embodiment of their beliefs, their relationships with the gods, and their understanding of fate. To the Vikings, treasure was a living entity, something imbued with divine power and cosmic significance, something that could shape the course of their lives and the world around them. The act of hiding treasure speaks to a much larger worldview. Vikings were keenly aware of the unpredictable nature of life. They lived in a world constantly at war, subject to violent raids and sudden shifts in fortune. Wealth could be gained or lost in an instant, and for the Viking warrior, treasure was as transient as life itself. However, unlike modern societies that often see treasure as a symbol of power or status, the Vikings saw their wealth as a tool to influence the forces of fate. This is why treasure was so carefully guarded, hidden away in secret places, buried beneath the earth. It was not enough to simply possess treasure. It had to be safeguarded from forces beyond one's control, particularly those of fate, the gods, and destiny. The Vikings' deep understanding of fate, the concept of WYRD, permeated every aspect of their lives, including their handling of treasure. They believed that fate was an inescapable force, one that shaped the events of their lives in ways that were beyond their control. However, fate was not entirely deterministic. The Vikings saw it as something that could be influenced by the will of the gods, by one's actions, and by the treasures they accumulated. A warrior could gain favor with the gods through his deeds, his bravery in battle, and the treasure he accumulated, but this favor was fickle. Treasure, then, wasn't simply something that could be acquired through force. It was a reward granted by the gods for demonstrating one's worth. When treasure was buried or hidden, it could be seen as a way of offering this wealth back to the gods, a way of ensuring that it would remain in divine hands and that it would only be revealed when the time was right, when someone worthy enough could find it. The idea of treasure being hidden for the right person to discover is fundamental to the Viking understanding of the world. In many ways, treasure was not meant to be owned by just anyone. It had to be claimed by someone who was worthy. This is reflected in the numerous sagas and mythological tales where treasure plays a central role. The hero who is destined to discover the treasure, often through a series of trials and tests, is not just a lucky finder. He is chosen by the gods. The treasure he uncovers is not just a material prize. It is a symbol of his worthiness, his ability to live up to the divine expectations placed upon him. For the Vikings, treasure was more than a possession. It was a reflection of one's relationship with the gods and fate. The buried treasure was a kind of spiritual lottery, where only those who had earned the favor of the gods could reveal it and claim it for their own. This belief in the divine connection of treasure is also reflected in Viking burial practices. When a Viking warrior died, they were often buried with their weapons, their armor, and sometimes their treasures. The idea was that these objects would accompany them on their journey to the afterlife, where they would need them to prove their worth in the hall of the gods. In this sense, treasure wasn't just material wealth. It was a form of spiritual currency, a means of securing divine favor for the deceased. The treasure buried with the dead was a way of ensuring that they were properly equipped for the afterlife, a means of ensuring that their deeds in this world would continue to shape their existence in the next. The treasures buried with the dead were not seen as relics of the past. They were tools for the future, both in the afterlife and for the generations that would come after. The act of burying treasure was also a way of preserving it for future generations. The Vikings understood the transience of life and the fragility of wealth, and so they hid their treasure away, not just for their own use, but for the future. By burying their treasures, they ensured that their wealth would not be lost or forgotten, that it would continue to endure long after they were gone. The buried treasure became a kind of time capsule, a means of passing down one's legacy and wealth to those who came after. However, the idea of the buried treasure as a legacy was not simply about passing down material wealth. It was about ensuring that the story of the Viking warrior would live on, that their deeds would be remembered. In this way, treasure served as a bridge between the past, present, and future. It was a means of connecting generations, ensuring that the deeds of the ancestors would not be forgotten, and that their influence would continue to reverberate through time. But even as the Vikings buried their treasures with the hope of passing them down, they also buried them with the knowledge that they might never be discovered. Some treasures were hidden in remote or inaccessible locations, hidden deep within forests, buried beneath rocks, or left in places that were difficult to find. This secrecy was not simply a means of protecting wealth from thieves or invaders. It was also a way of ensuring that the treasure remained untouched by the wrong hands. The act of hiding treasure was a way of controlling its fate, ensuring that it would not fall into the hands of those who were not worthy. This belief in the selective nature of treasure, that it could only be claimed by those who were destined to find it, speaks to a deeper spiritual and philosophical understanding of wealth. Treasure, in this context, was not just a material possession. It was a tool of fate, a force that could only be wielded by those who were worthy enough to claim it. The treasures that have been uncovered by archaeologists and treasure hunters over the years have provided a window into the Viking world, revealing both the material wealth they accumulated and the cultural beliefs that surrounded it. Many of these hoards contain more than just coins and jewels. They contain items of great cultural and spiritual significance. Weapons, shields, armor, and even religious artifacts have been found alongside the gold and silver, suggesting that treasure was deeply intertwined with the Vikings' understanding of the divine and the spiritual world. These objects were not just possessions. They were tools of fate, symbols of divine favor, and markers of the warrior's journey through life and death. As we look at the Viking treasure hoards uncovered today, we are not just seeing material wealth. We are seeing the intersection of spirituality, culture, and history. Treasure was not simply something the Vikings possessed for personal gain. It was a reflection of their belief in fate, honor, and divine favor. The treasures they buried were not meant to be kept for their own use. They were meant to be part of a larger spiritual and cultural narrative. They were tools to shape the destiny of the individual, the community, and the gods themselves. In hiding their treasure, the Vikings ensured that their legacy would endure, that their deeds would be remembered, and that their influence would be felt long after they were gone. The mystery of Viking treasure continues to captivate us today because it speaks to something universal in the human experience: the desire for legacy, for meaning, and for connection to something greater than oneself. When we uncover these treasures, we are not simply finding gold and silver. We are uncovering the story of a people who lived by a code of honor and fate, whose lives were shaped by the forces of the gods and destiny. Every treasure hoard tells a story, and every story reveals a piece of the complex, fascinating world of the Vikings. The discovery of these treasures brings us closer to understanding not just the Vikings themselves, but the larger human experience of wealth, fate, and the desire to leave a lasting legacy. The discovery of Viking treasure today is often met with a sense of awe and excitement, not just because of the material wealth that it represents, but because of the deep, enduring mystery that surrounds these finds. For centuries, treasure hunters, archaeologists, and historians alike have been fascinated by the idea of buried Viking wealth, waiting to be uncovered. But the treasures themselves, the gold, silver, coins, jewelry, weapons, and armor, are not the only things that capture our imagination. What is truly captivating is the rich narrative that these treasures carry, a narrative of a people whose lives were defined by their relationship with the gods, fate, and the natural world. Every hoard, every artifact uncovered, brings us closer to understanding how the Vikings saw the world and how they viewed the connection between treasure, legacy, and the divine. To understand why these treasures were hidden in the first place, we must examine the broader context of Viking society, including their complex relationship with death, the afterlife, and the gods. For the Vikings, the act of treasure burial was more than just a practical safeguard against raiders or invaders. It was a deeply spiritual practice, tied to their beliefs about life, death, and fate. The Vikings believed that death was not an end but a continuation of life in another form, and treasure was seen as a means of ensuring the warrior's success in the afterlife. When a warrior died, he would be buried with his possessions, his armor, weapons, and treasure, to ensure that he had the tools needed to survive and thrive in the world of the gods. The belief in the afterlife was not just about physical survival. It was about continuing one's legacy, and treasure was a key part of that legacy. The idea of legacy was central to Viking culture. For the Vikings, what mattered most was how they would be remembered after they were gone. It was not enough to live a life of wealth and power if those achievements were not passed down through the generations. The Vikings were acutely aware of the transient nature of life, and the act of burying treasure was a way of ensuring that their accomplishments would endure. These treasures were meant to outlive their creators, waiting for the right person, often a descendant or someone worthy, to claim them. By hiding their treasures, the Vikings ensured that their wealth would be preserved and passed on, even after their empires and kingdoms had fallen. In this sense, treasure was not just material wealth. It was a tool for ensuring the continuity of their legacy, a way of ensuring that their deeds would live on long after their death. But the Vikings' relationship with treasure was also tied to their understanding of fate and the will of the gods. Treasure, for the Vikings, was not something that could be easily obtained or controlled. It was something that had to be earned through strength, bravery, and honor. To possess treasure was to have the gods' favor, but that favor could easily be taken away. The Vikings understood that wealth could be fleeting, and treasure was often hidden to protect it from the capriciousness of fate. It was also a way of ensuring that treasure would only be claimed by those who were worthy. The gods, it was believed, would reveal the treasure to those who had earned it, and this idea is reflected in many of the Viking sagas and myths. In these stories, treasure is often buried or hidden until the right person, often a hero or a chosen warrior, is able to uncover it. This belief in the divine connection of treasure is further reflected in the Viking burial practices. When a warrior died, the treasures buried with him were not just possessions. They were seen as tools that would help the deceased navigate the afterlife. The Vikings believed that the afterlife was a place where warriors would be tested by the gods, and treasure was seen as a means of securing their place in the divine realm. Weapons and armor were often placed in graves with the deceased to ensure that they had the strength and tools necessary to fight in the afterlife. Treasure, then, was not just about wealth. It was about ensuring that the warrior was properly equipped to prove his worth before the gods. The Vikings also believed that treasure was connected to the forces of fate, and that the gods had a hand in determining when and where treasure would be discovered. Treasure was often hidden in remote or difficult-to-reach locations, buried deep within the earth or hidden beneath rocks. This was not just a practical measure to protect the treasure from invaders or thieves. It was a way of ensuring that the treasure remained in the hands of the worthy. Treasure, it was believed, could not simply be claimed by anyone. It had to be earned, and it had to be revealed at the right time. This idea of treasure being hidden until the time was right is reflected in many Viking myths and sagas, where treasures are often buried and only revealed to those who are worthy of their power. In many ways, treasure was not just a physical object but a spiritual one, and its discovery was seen as part of a larger divine plan. This divine connection between treasure and fate is also evident in the way the Vikings viewed the land and the natural world. The Vikings had a deep respect for the earth, and they believed that the land itself held the power to shape their fate. Treasure was often buried in places that were considered sacred, places where the gods were believed to dwell. It was not uncommon for treasure to be hidden near natural features like lakes, rivers, or forests, locations that were seen as imbued with spiritual significance. By burying their treasures in these sacred places, the Vikings ensured that their wealth would remain connected to the divine forces that governed their lives. The land itself, in this sense, was not just a place to live and fight. It was an active participant in the spiritual life of the Vikings. The practice of hiding treasure, then, was not just about safeguarding wealth. It was about ensuring that treasure would remain in the hands of the worthy, and that it would be revealed only when the gods deemed it appropriate. Treasure was tied to fate, to the gods, and to the land, and its discovery was seen as a moment of divine intervention. The Vikings believed that treasure had a life of its own, and that its discovery was part of a larger cosmic plan. This belief in the divine power of treasure is what makes Viking hoards so fascinating. They were not just collections of valuable objects. They were symbols of the Vikings' relationship with the gods, their understanding of fate, and their desire to secure their legacy. As modern-day archaeologists and treasure hunters continue to uncover these hoards, we are reminded of the intricate, spiritual world in which the Vikings lived. Each new discovery offers a glimpse into their beliefs, their values, and their understanding of the divine. And yet, even as we uncover these treasures, we are left with many questions. Why did the Vikings hide their treasure? What were they trying to achieve by burying it? And what did they believe about the nature of fate, the gods, and the afterlife? These questions may never be fully answered, but each treasure hoard we uncover brings us closer to understanding the complexities of the Viking worldview and their deeply spiritual relationship with treasure. In the end, Viking treasure is more than just wealth. It is a symbol of their connection to the gods, their desire to leave a legacy, and their belief in the power of fate. The treasures they buried were not just material possessions. They were tools for securing divine favor, ensuring the success of their descendants, and passing on their stories. When we uncover these treasures today, we are not just finding gold and silver. We are uncovering the spirit of a people who lived by a code of honor, fate, and divine destiny. And in that sense, the treasure we find is just as much a part of the Vikings as their warriors, their gods, and their legends. Viking treasure is often described in terms of its material wealth, the gold, silver, and precious objects that were sought after for centuries. But what if the real value of these treasures lies not in their intrinsic worth, but in the story they tell about the Vikings' understanding of power, destiny, and the supernatural? To truly appreciate Viking treasure, we need to look beyond the surface. Each artifact, each hoard uncovered, holds a deeper meaning, one that is tied to the Vikings' worldview, their belief in fate, and their connection to the gods. The treasure they left behind is not just a collection of valuable items. It is a window into the very essence of Viking society. At the core of Viking treasure is the belief in WYRD, the concept of fate. For the Vikings, fate was not something passive. It was an active force that shaped every aspect of their lives. WYRD was both personal and cosmic, influencing the actions of individuals and the course of history. It was something that could not be avoided or changed, yet it was something that could be influenced by one's actions. The idea that a warrior's deeds in battle could alter his fate, or that treasure could be a means of securing divine favor, is central to understanding why treasure was so important in Viking culture. Treasure was seen not just as material wealth but as a manifestation of WYRD, a tangible sign of a warrior's connection to the gods and his place in the world. For a Viking warrior, acquiring treasure was a sign that he had earned the gods' favor, that his actions on the battlefield had aligned with divine will. In this sense, treasure was a reflection of personal achievement, of honor, and of the favor of the gods. It was not simply a reward for victory. It was a confirmation of the warrior's place in the larger cosmic order. This connection between treasure and fate is one of the reasons why Vikings went to such great lengths to bury their hoards. The treasure was not just for the benefit of the living. It was meant to play a role in the warrior's afterlife, ensuring that his legacy would endure and that his name would be remembered. The burial of treasure is also tied to the Viking belief in the afterlife. The Vikings believed that death was not an end but a continuation of one's journey. The most famous of these afterlife beliefs was Valhalla, the great hall of the slain, where warriors who died in battle were honored by the gods. To ensure their place in Valhalla, warriors would often be buried with their treasure, their weapons, shields, and other valuables. These items were not just for the warrior's earthly comfort. They were necessary tools for surviving the trials of the afterlife. Weapons were not only practical. They were symbols of the warrior's strength, and their presence in the grave was believed to ensure that the warrior could continue fighting alongside the gods. This belief highlights the deep spiritual connection between treasure and the afterlife, and how treasure was viewed not just as material wealth but as a means of ensuring eternal honor and glory. But what of the treasure that was hidden away, that was buried deep within the earth and left to be uncovered only by those who were deemed worthy? This brings us to another layer of Viking treasure: its connection to prophecy and the divine will. Treasure hoards were often hidden in remote or sacred locations, places believed to be connected to the gods or otherworldly forces. The act of burying treasure in these locations was not just a way of safeguarding wealth. It was a way of ensuring that the treasure would be revealed at the right moment, to the right person. The Vikings believed that treasure had its own destiny, and that it would only be discovered by those who were worthy of it. This connection between treasure and prophecy is reflected in many Viking sagas and myths, where treasure is often hidden away until a hero or warrior comes along who is worthy of claiming it. The treasure, in these stories, is not just a material object. It is a key to unlocking the hero's destiny. This idea of treasure having a predetermined fate speaks to the broader Viking belief in the gods' influence over the world. The gods, according to Viking belief, were not distant or removed from human affairs. They were active participants in the lives of mortals. The treasure that was buried or hidden by the Vikings was seen as being under the control of the gods, and it would only be revealed at the right time. This divine control over treasure is a reflection of the Vikings' understanding of fate. They believed that treasure was not simply a reward for earthly actions. It was a tool to shape the future, to influence the course of events, and to ensure that the gods' will was fulfilled. By hiding treasure, the Vikings were placing it under the protection of the divine, ensuring that it would not fall into the wrong hands and that it would be revealed only when the gods saw fit. The burial of treasure was also a means of ensuring that the wealth would not be lost to time. The Vikings understood the impermanence of wealth and the fleeting nature of life, and so they hid their treasures to protect them from being lost or stolen. By burying their treasure, they were ensuring that it would survive through the ages, waiting for future generations to discover it. In this way, treasure was not just about material wealth. It was about legacy. The Vikings wanted to ensure that their achievements would be remembered long after they were gone. Treasure hoards were a way of preserving their legacy, of passing down their story to future generations. These hoards were not just material possessions. They were markers of Viking history, symbols of the warrior's strength and honor, and keys to unlocking the past. When treasure is discovered today, it is often found buried in remote locations, in places that were once believed to be sacred or divinely protected. These treasures are not simply items of value. They are windows into the Viking worldview. The treasure that the Vikings buried was not just meant to be a means of acquiring wealth. It was meant to serve as a bridge between the mortal world and the divine. The Vikings believed that treasure had the power to shape fate, to influence the course of events, and to ensure that their legacy would endure. When we uncover these treasures today, we are not just finding coins and jewels. We are uncovering a deeper story about the Vikings' beliefs in the gods, fate, and the afterlife. The discovery of Viking treasure is a reminder that wealth, in Viking culture, was not just about what you could possess or accumulate. It was about what you could give, how you could ensure that your legacy endured, and how you could secure a place in the divine realm. Treasure was not simply material. It was symbolic, spiritual, and tied to the very fabric of Viking life. The treasure that the Vikings left behind is not just a record of their wealth. It is a testament to their belief in fate, in the gods, and in the power of legacy. By hiding their treasure, they ensured that their story would live on, that their deeds would not be forgotten, and that their influence would continue to shape the world long after their death. As we continue to uncover Viking treasure hoards, we are not just rediscovering wealth from a long-lost age. We are uncovering a history that was shaped by the gods, by fate, and by the desire for immortality. The treasure left behind by the Vikings is a key to understanding not only their material wealth but their spiritual worldview, their connection to the divine, and their belief in the power of legacy. Each new discovery brings us closer to understanding a people whose lives were governed by fate, honor, and divine intervention, and whose treasures continue to reveal the mysteries of their world. The continued excavation of Viking treasure provides us with an unparalleled opportunity to gain insight into the lives of a civilization whose mythological and historical legacies continue to captivate the world. As each treasure hoard is unearthed, we are not merely discovering wealth, but are uncovering a deep narrative about the relationship between the Vikings and their world. In many ways, these treasures serve as the physical manifestation of the Vikings' most fundamental beliefs. Their connection to the gods, their understanding of fate, and their devotion to honor and legacy. The objects found, often weapons, jewelry, coins, and even tools, provide a glimpse into a society whose values and spiritual life were intricately woven into the material world. What stands out about Viking treasure is the way in which it is not only a symbol of wealth but also a spiritual and cultural artifact. Each item is more than just an object of trade or exchange. It is a key that unlocks the mysteries of the Viking soul. For the Vikings, treasure was never simply an accumulation of gold or jewels. It was seen as a means of aligning oneself with divine favor. Possessing treasure was viewed as proof that the gods had smiled upon you, granting you power, influence, and, above all, the chance to shape your destiny. Yet the Vikings understood that treasure was a double-edged sword, a force that could be easily lost if one failed to honor it properly. Treasure was something that demanded respect and responsibility, and its rightful possession was tied to the ideals of personal courage, loyalty, and divine providence. It is often said that the Vikings lived by a code of honor, a set of values that governed their every action, especially in the heat of battle. These values were not just abstract concepts. They were deeply tied to the material world, with treasure serving as both the reward and the symbol of one's adherence to the Viking code. In battle, the Viking warrior fought not just for land or glory, but for the favor of the gods, who could bestow treasure upon those deemed worthy. To be granted treasure was to be recognized as having lived a life of honor, strength, and courage. But this honor came at a price. The Vikings believed that treasure was something to be earned, not simply acquired. To possess treasure was to carry the weight of responsibility, a responsibility to use it wisely, to protect it, and, most importantly, to pass it on to the right heirs. This sense of responsibility is reflected in the Vikings' burial practices, where the deceased were often buried with their treasures, weapons, coins, and personal belongings, to ensure that their legacy would continue after death. The burial of treasure with the dead highlights the Vikings' deep connection between treasure, legacy, and the afterlife. In their belief system, death was not an end but a transformation, and the treasure buried with a warrior was meant to ensure his survival and success in the next world. The warrior who died with treasure was not simply buried with his wealth. He was buried with the tools necessary to prove his worth before the gods and to secure his place in the afterlife. These treasures were believed to hold spiritual power, and their presence in the grave was thought to ensure that the warrior would be granted entry into Valhalla or other realms of the afterlife, depending on the nature of his deeds. But not all treasure was meant for the afterlife. Some hoards were buried with the intention of being rediscovered by future generations, a form of spiritual inheritance passed down through the ages. For the Vikings, this was a way of ensuring that their legacy would live on long after their death. Treasure was seen as a means of bridging the gap between the past, the present, and the future. In this sense, the buried treasure was not just a sign of wealth. It was a promise that the deeds of the Vikings would not be forgotten. The treasure hoards unearthed by archaeologists today are not just material objects. They are the keys to understanding the cultural and spiritual worldview of the Vikings. The items found, often intricately crafted weapons, jewelry, and personal artifacts, are not just symbols of wealth. They are the embodiment of Viking ideals and the mysteries of their beliefs. In many ways, Viking treasure was about securing not just material wealth but spiritual immortality. The Vikings believed that by leaving behind treasure, they could ensure their place in the memory of future generations. They wanted their deeds, their accomplishments, and their honor to be remembered long after they had passed away. Treasure was not simply about what you possessed in life. It was about what you left behind, what would outlast your mortal existence. This is why the treasures buried in Viking hoards are often found in places that were thought to be sacred or powerful. The act of hiding treasure in such locations was believed to tie the wealth to the divine, ensuring that it would be preserved for future generations to discover, and that it would remain untouched by time and fortune. The connection between treasure and divine favor is also evident in the way the Vikings viewed their gods. The gods were not distant or removed from the lives of mortals. They were active participants in the world, shaping the fates of men and women through their actions. For the Vikings, treasure was something that was granted by the gods in recognition of one's worth. It was a reward for living a life of honor, strength, and courage. But treasure was also seen as a tool for shaping the future. The treasure of the past was not just a relic, It was a force that could be used to shape destiny. By passing down treasure from one generation to the next, the Vikings believed they could ensure the survival of their culture, their values, and their legacy. Treasure was not just about personal wealth. It was about the continuation of Viking ideals and the perpetuation of their worldview. The act of burying treasure also reflects the Vikings' understanding of time and fate. They understood that their time in this world was fleeting and that the events of their lives were shaped by forces beyond their control. Treasure, for the Vikings, was a way of defying the passage of time, of ensuring that their deeds would endure even after their death. The burial of treasure was a way of preserving not just material wealth, but the legacy of a warrior, a king, or a tribe. Treasure was a bridge between the mortal and divine realms, a means of ensuring that the spirit of the Viking warrior would live on, even as his body returned to the earth. When treasure is discovered today, it is often found in remote, forgotten places, in locations that were once thought to be sacred or divinely protected. These treasures are not just material objects. They are symbols of the Viking relationship with the gods, with fate, and with the passage of time. The treasures buried in these places were meant to endure through the ages, to outlast the Vikings themselves and to ensure that their names, their deeds, and their culture would be remembered. As each treasure hoard is uncovered, we are reminded of the profound spiritual significance that these treasures held for the Vikings. They were not just wealth. They were markers of divine favor, tools of fate, and keys to immortality. In the end, the discovery of Viking treasure is not just a material find. It is a spiritual and historical revelation. The treasure left behind by the Vikings tells the story of a people who lived by a code of honor and destiny, whose relationship with the gods and the afterlife was intertwined with their material wealth. Each hoard, each item uncovered, serves as a link to the past, reminding us of a world where treasure was not simply a means of acquiring wealth, but a means of shaping the future, securing a legacy, and ensuring divine favor. As we continue to uncover these treasures, we are not just finding gold and silver. We are uncovering a worldview, a culture, and a story that continues to resonate in the present day. The discovery of Viking treasure today continues to be a source of both fascination and mystery, but it also forces us to confront some difficult truths about the past. While the treasure itself is beautiful in its craftsmanship and historical significance, what it truly represents is a more complex and darker story. Beneath the glittering gold and intricate designs lies a history shaped by conquest, violence, and the often brutal struggle for power. The Vikings, despite their reverence for honor and fate, were also warriors who carved out their place in the world through raids and bloody battles. Treasure, in many ways, is the byproduct of this aggression. It tells a story of survival, of societies built on conflict and the spoils of war. For the Vikings, treasure was not just about wealth but about power and prestige. It was a symbol of success in battle, a reward for the might and skill of a warrior who had proven himself worthy. But treasure was also a tool of intimidation, a means of asserting dominance over other tribes and nations. When the Vikings raided their neighbors or traveled across the seas to conquer distant lands, they sought not just land but resources that could help elevate their status. The treasures they plundered became symbols of their strength and an ever-present reminder of their ability to shape the world around them. The wealth they accumulated was not simply for personal gain. It was part of a larger political strategy, one that emphasized power through the acquisition of material goods. In the context of Viking raids and conquests, treasure also becomes a symbol of the transient nature of power. A hoard of treasure could change hands in an instant. A king or warrior could gain incredible wealth in a raid, only to see it taken from him by a rival. The Vikings understood the fleeting nature of wealth and glory, which is why they placed such importance on securing their treasure for future generations. But this also means that treasure, in the Viking worldview, was a constant reminder that nothing was permanent. Not wealth, not life, and not even the honor gained through battle. Despite all their strength and power, the Vikings knew that fate could turn against them at any moment. This is why the burial of treasure, especially in hidden and sacred places, carries such weight. It was not just an act of safeguarding wealth from invaders or thieves. The Vikings buried their treasure with a sense of hope and desperation. They believed that by burying it, they were ensuring that their legacy would endure, even if they could not personally enjoy the fruits of their conquest. Treasure, then, was a means of immortality, a way of controlling fate in a world where everything was uncertain. But in doing so, the Vikings also left behind a reminder that their power was always at risk, always tied to forces beyond their control. Forces that shaped not only their destinies but the destinies of their treasures as well. As the centuries pass, Viking treasure continues to captivate our imagination, serving not only as a window into their wealth, but also into the spiritual and cultural intricacies of their civilization. The treasures buried by the Vikings were not mere collections of precious metals and objects. They were imbued with deep significance. Each hoard is a testament to the Vikings' belief that wealth was an extension of divine favor and a crucial part of their legacy. These treasures were not only material rewards for a lifetime of conquest but were, in many ways, the keys to the afterlife. They were meant to honor the gods, ensure eternal glory, and secure a warrior's place in the afterlife. The Vikings' practice of burying treasure was a manifestation of their understanding of fate, legacy, and the divine. They saw their treasures as more than just wealth. They were vital components of their spiritual journey. The buried hoards, often hidden in sacred or remote locations, symbolized the Vikings' belief that treasure was a force tied to fate, a force that could only be unlocked by the worthy. As modern archaeologists unearth these treasures, we uncover not just gold and silver, but a deeper understanding of Viking life, their gods, and their indomitable spirit to leave a lasting legacy for future generations. Viking treasure, much like their culture, was a paradox, earthly yet divine, material yet spiritual. When these treasures were buried, they were not simply meant to be hoarded, but to transcend time. Each item, from coins to weapons, was imbued with meaning far beyond its material worth. These treasures were meant to secure the warrior's place in the afterlife and ensure that their legacy would be honored for centuries to come. The gods themselves were believed to have a hand in the fate of these treasures, controlling when and how they would be revealed. In many ways, these treasures were more than just wealth. They were divine instruments, tied to the eternal and the cosmic flow of destiny. Viking treasure, once unearthed, continues to tell us more than just the material history of a long-gone people. These treasures represent a window into a spiritual world, one where fate, honor, and divine favor dictated the course of a person's life. The items, coins, swords, jewelry, were not simply possessions but symbols of worth, victory, and connection to the gods. Through these hoards, we are reminded that treasure was never just about wealth but about securing a place in the afterlife, leaving a lasting legacy, and shaping one's destiny. An enduring reflection of the Viking ethos that treasure was both a gift and a responsibility. Viking treasure, when uncovered, offers us more than just glimpses into their wealth. It is a portal to understanding the psyche of a civilization driven by honor, fate, and divine favor. These treasures were often carefully hidden, sometimes buried in sacred grounds or remote locations, suggesting a belief that wealth had a higher purpose. The Vikings understood treasure as both a blessing and a burden, something to be handled with reverence and caution. They believed it could secure immortality, preserve legacies, and influence the course of one's fate. But this belief also came with risks. Possessing treasure was a sign of divine favor, but it also meant bearing the responsibility of how it was used. Greed and selfishness, as depicted in many sagas, led to downfall and tragedy. Treasure was seen not only as wealth but as a powerful spiritual tool that could change the course of one's destiny. For the Vikings, treasure was more than material gain. It was a key to understanding life's purpose, a tangible connection to the divine, and a tool that could be used for greatness or destruction. Each hoard uncovered is a testament to this belief, revealing the complexities of Viking life and their relationship with the gods. The discovery of Viking treasure hoards is more than just an archaeological pursuit. It is a direct connection to the past, offering us a glimpse into the spiritual and cultural framework of the Viking world. These treasures, buried with such care and reverence, carry the weight of the Viking understanding of fate, legacy, and divine favor. Each object unearthed, whether it's a sword, a coin, or a piece of jewelry, carries with it a story of the warrior it once belonged to, a story of courage, ambition, and belief in the gods. The treasures were not simply accumulated for wealth but were tools to secure a place in the afterlife and ensure that the warrior's legacy would endure for generations. Yet, even as we unearth these treasures, their true meaning remains elusive. They are not just relics. They are cultural artifacts that embody the complex spiritual practices of the Vikings. They speak of a civilization where treasure was a symbol of honor, a reward for those aligned with the divine, and a means to ensure that the stories of the past would continue to shape the future. These hoards, though tangible and material, represent something far greater, a deeper connection to a world where the divine and the mortal were inseparable. The uncovering of Viking treasure is not merely an archaeological triumph. It is a moment of profound cultural revelation. These treasures, buried with such care and reverence, serve as a tangible link to a world that was as spiritually rich as it was materially complex. As each hoard is unearthed, we are reminded of the Vikings' intricate relationship with their gods, their understanding of fate, and their desire for immortality. The treasures they left behind are not simply relics of a warrior's wealth. They are symbols of a belief system that sought to intertwine the mortal and divine in ways that transcend time. Through these discoveries, we are granted access to the deepest layers of Viking history, seeing beyond the warrior's armor or the spoils of war. The treasures reveal a people who saw their wealth as a reflection of divine approval, an acknowledgement of their actions and honor in life. Every coin, every weapon, every jewel was not just a material possession, but a token of favor from the gods, a gift earned through courage, strength, and loyalty. Yet, beyond the material worth of these treasures, there exists a deeper meaning: the treasure's role in perpetuating the Viking ethos and ensuring the legacy of those who earned it. For the Vikings, treasure was a means to transcend death, to secure a place in the afterlife, and to ensure that their deeds, their strength, and their honor would not be forgotten. It was more than a reward. It was a bridge to immortality. In the end, these treasures, long hidden beneath the earth, are not just tokens of a bygone era. They are the keys to understanding a culture that lived in deep reverence of fate, divine will, and the legacy of warriors. Each treasure uncovered tells a story of not just gold, silver, and riches, but of belief, purpose, and the unyielding desire to live on through history. The Viking treasure hoards, now re-emerging after centuries of silence, continue to whisper the tales of gods, warriors, and the never-ending quest for immortality. As we close this exploration of Viking treasure, we are left with a profound sense of mystery and awe. These treasures, buried for centuries, offer us more than just a glimpse into the material wealth of the Vikings. They reveal the deeper, spiritual currents that shaped their lives and their worldview. The Viking belief that treasure was not merely gold and silver, but a divine gift tied to fate, destiny, and legacy, transforms our understanding of their culture. Each artifact, each hoard unearthed, tells the story of a people who saw their wealth as an extension of their connection to the gods, a means of ensuring their place in the afterlife, securing their legacy, and shaping the fate of their descendants. The Vikings were not just raiders or warriors. They were a people deeply in tune with the spiritual forces that governed their lives. Treasure was not simply something to be acquired for personal gain, but something to be used with honor, respect, and reverence. It was an instrument of the gods, a reflection of one's worth, and a means of ensuring immortality. The treasure buried in Viking mounds, hidden in caves, or safeguarded in sacred places was more than just wealth. It was a message from the past, telling us that the Vikings saw their lives as part of a much larger cosmic struggle, one in which treasure played a pivotal role. The discoveries of these ancient hoards are not merely archaeological events. They are powerful reminders of a lost civilization that saw treasure not as an end, but as a means to fulfill divine purpose. These treasures, unearthed by modern-day archaeologists, help us piece together the spiritual fabric of Viking society. Through these relics, we are reminded of the deep human desire to connect with something greater, to leave a legacy that endures beyond the confines of mortal life. As we reflect on the significance of Viking treasure, it becomes clear that the legacy of the Vikings is not just in their conquests or their ability to explore distant lands, but in the values they left behind, values of honor, courage, and respect for the divine. These treasures, now buried beneath the soil, continue to speak to us, telling us stories of a time when wealth was not just about what one possessed, but about what one could give to the world and to the gods. The mysteries of Viking treasure are far from fully understood, but one thing is certain. These treasures will continue to fascinate, inspire, and challenge us as we seek to unlock the secrets of the past.